There is a story that nobody in any history classroom ever told you. Not because it was lost, not because the evidence was buried too deep to find, but because the people who control what gets taught, what gets published, what gets called legitimate scholarship, they have a reason to keep it quiet. And that reason is simple. The families who owned Britain before the Normans arrived in 1066 did not disappear. They did not vanish into the mist of Dark Age legend. Their bloodlines did not end. They survived. They adapted. They spread. And if you follow the threads carefully, if you trace the land grants and the marriage records and the genealogical documents that most historians quietly skip over, those same bloodlines reach across the Atlantic Ocean and touch the earliest layers of something that American archaeology has been arguing about for over a century. The question of who was really here first. Who built what? Who knew what? And who decided that certain things about the deep American past would never become common knowledge? If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where are you right now and what time is it. Before we go anywhere, we need to understand something about how history actually works. Not how it's supposed to work, not how your teachers described it, but how it really functions when powerful interests are involved. History is not a neutral recording of events. It is a selection. Someone chooses what to preserve, someone chooses what to highlight. Someone chooses which ruins get funded for excavation and which ones get quietly fenced off and forgotten. And when those choices consistently point in the same direction, when the same categories of evidence keep getting minimized or dismissed or simply never mentioned in mainstream accounts, that pattern itself becomes the story. That pattern is what we are going to follow tonight. And the pattern starts in Britain, long before the Normans crossed the Channel, long before William the Conqueror planted his flag at Hastings in 1066 and rewrote the ownership of an entire island, long before the French-speaking aristocracy began parceling out English land to their loyal knights and relatives. There were families already there, families with deep roots, families whose relationship to the land of Britain stretched back not decades or centuries but millennia. Families who understood something about that island, about its sacred geography, about its ancient monuments, about its hidden rivers and hollow hills, that the newcomers from Normandy would spend generations trying to learn and never fully understand. These were the Anglo-Saxon things, and the Welsh princes, and the Scottish mormares, and the Cornish chieftains. They were the descendants of the Romano-British aristocracy that survived the withdrawal of the legions. They carried in their blood the memory of something even older, the Celtic tribal hierarchies, the pre-Roman Bronze Age chieftains whose burial mounds still dot the British landscape, the Neolithic monument builders who raised Stonehenge and Avebury and the great passage tombs of the Boyne Valley in Ireland. These were not primitive people. These were the inheritors of a tradition of land stewardship and sacred geography that modern archaeology is only beginning to take seriously. And they did not simply vanish when the Normans came. That is the lie that most history books tell, through omission more than outright falsehood. The narrative goes something like this. The Normans conquered England. They replaced the Anglo-Saxon nobility with their own people. The old families were dispossessed. And then England became Norman, then Angevin, then Plantagenet, building toward the recognizable monarchy of later centuries. The old British world was over. The pre-Norman families were historical footnotes at best, except that is not what happened. Not completely, not even mostly. What actually happened was far more complicated, far more interesting, and in its long-term consequences, far more significant than any textbook will tell you. What happened was a process of absorption, intermarriage, strategic alliance, and selective survival that allowed certain pre-Norman bloodlines to persist inside the new Norman aristocratic structure, sometimes invisibly, sometimes hidden behind adopted French surnames, sometimes preserved through daughters who married Norman lords and carried their ancient lineages forward in ways that the male-focused genealogical records of the era consistently obscured. To understand why this matters, we need to go back much further than 1066. We need to go back to the families themselves, to who they were, to what they knew, to what they held, and to why any of this has anything to do with the hidden history of pre-Columbian America, which is the place this story is ultimately heading, because these two things are connected. Not in the obvious way that sensational theories always want to claim. Not through a single dramatic event or a single heroic voyage, but through something more subtle and more durable, through the transmission of knowledge, through the movement of people across water, through the existence of networks that predate any modern nation-state by thousands of years and that have never fully stopped operating. So let us start at the beginning, or as close to a beginning as we can reasonably reach. There is a family. There are actually many families, but let us start with one that represents the archetype, the template, the pattern that repeats itself in different forms across British history. They do not have a single name because the naming conventions of pre-Norman Britain were not dynastic in the way that later European aristocracy would be. They were defined by land and lineage and the particular kind of authority that came from long association with a specific place. They were, in the language of the Anglo-Saxon world, the ealdormen, the high reeves, the thengs of ancient standing, and in their veins ran something that the Normans could never simply purchase or conquer: memory. The deep institutional memory of a landscape, the knowledge of which hills were sacred and which were merely inconvenient, the knowledge of where the old agreements between families had been sworn and what those agreements required, the knowledge of which routes through the forest were safe, in which seasons and why. The knowledge, in some cases, of things that predated even the Anglo-Saxon settlement of Britain, things that went back to the Roman period and before it to the Celtic tribal world, and before that to the Bronze Age chieftains who had organized British society for 1,000 years, before Julius Caesar ever looked across the narrow sea. This knowledge was not written down in any form that the Normans could seize and catalogue. It was carried in people, in families, in the oral traditions, and the remembered landscapes, and the practical wisdom of communities that had been working the same land for generations beyond counting. And because it was carried in people, it could not be confiscated. It could not be transferred by charter or treaty. It could only be transmitted through relationship, through marriage, through the slow process by which the new Norman lords gradually realized that the people they had displaced knew things that they needed to know. That realization created an opening, and through that opening, certain pre-Norman bloodlines walked, not triumphantly, not with any public acknowledgement of what was happening, but quietly, persistently, in the way that water finds its way through stone, not by force, but by patience. The process worked differently in different parts of Britain. In England itself, the Norman Conquest was most thorough. The great Anglo-Saxon noble families of Mercia and Northumbria and Wessex, families whose roots went back to the original settlement of England in the 5th and 6th centuries, families who had names like Leofric and Elfgar and Cywood, these families were largely dispossessed within a generation of the conquest. Their lands were given to Norman lords. Their influence was broken. Their male lines were often physically eliminated through battle, execution, or flight into exile. But their female lines were not. And this is the crucial point that most genealogical analysis of the Norman Conquest period consistently fails to adequately address. The daughters of the old Anglo-Saxon nobility did not simply disappear. They became valuable. They became desirable marriage partners for the new Norman lords precisely because those daughters carried something their Norman husbands lacked: English legitimacy, local knowledge, the loyalty of the remaining English population, which, however grudging and resentful, was more likely to be extended to a lord who had married into the old families than to one who was entirely foreign. So the marriages happened, and through those marriages, the bloodlines persisted, hidden, transformed, carrying French names rather than English ones, operating within a Norman social structure rather than an Anglo-Saxon one, but present, genetically present, culturally present in ways that would take centuries to fully understand. In Wales, the situation was different. The Norman conquest of England in 1066 did not extend fully into Wales. The Marcher lords, the Norman lords given lands on the Welsh border, spent the better part of 3 centuries trying to push into Welsh territory, and were largely unsuccessful in eliminating the native Welsh princely dynasties. Families like the descendants of Rhodri Mawr, the great 9th century king who had briefly united much of Wales, continued to rule in the Welsh uplands. The princes of Gwynedd in the north, the princes of Deheubarth in the southwest, the lords of Powys in the east. These dynasties survived. The Norman period, adapted to its pressures, and maintained continuity with a Welsh aristocratic tradition that stretched back before the Romans. That Welsh aristocratic tradition carried something that is critically important to the story we are telling. It carried memory of the pre-Roman British world, the world before the legions came, the world of the Celtic tribes, the world in which the British Isles were part of a network of sacred sites and seasonal gatherings and long-distance connections that spanned not just the islands themselves, but reached across the sea to Brittany in France, to Ireland, to Iberia, and in ways that mainstream archaeology has been extremely reluctant to take seriously, possibly much further. In Scotland, the situation was different again. The Norman influence penetrated Scotland through a different channel. Not through military conquest as in England, but through the deliberate adoption of Norman institutions and Norman nobility by the Scottish kings of the 12th century. David I of Scotland, who had been educated at the English court and had close ties to the Anglo-Norman aristocracy, brought Norman families into Scotland and gave them lands alongside the existing Scottish noble families. The result was a hybrid aristocracy, in which Norman surnames like Bruce and Balliol and Comyn coexisted with and intermarried with ancient Scottish dynasties of Pictish and Gaelic descent. And the Pictish element of that Scottish aristocracy is one of the most mysterious and least understood threads in British genealogical history. The Picts, the people who dominated eastern Scotland before the Gaelic takeover of the 9th century, left almost no written records. Their symbol stones, scattered across eastern Scotland, bear intricate carved symbols whose meaning has never been conclusively decoded. Their language is known only from a handful of inscriptions. Their social structure, their religion, their understanding of their own origins, all of this is largely lost. But their descendants are not lost. The aristocratic families of eastern Scotland who survived into the medieval period carried Pictish ancestry, and some of them survived into the modern era in ways that are documented but rarely discussed. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Before we can talk about survival and transmission and the long reach of these bloodlines into the modern world and into the American story, we need to talk about what these families actually knew, what they actually held, what made their ancient knowledge worth preserving across centuries of political transformation. Because here is the thing about the pre-Norman aristocracy of Britain that most people, even serious historians, have never fully grappled with. These families were not simply landowners in the modern sense. They were not simply wealthy people who happened to own large estates. They were custodians. Custodians of a relationship between human communities and specific landscapes that had been established over thousands of years. A relationship that involved not just practical knowledge of agricultural cycles and water management and forest resources, though it certainly included all of those things, but also a deeper kind of knowledge, a knowledge of what might be called the sacred geography of Britain, the network of ancient monuments and ley alignments and sacred springs and power places that the pre-Roman inhabitants of Britain had mapped and marked and maintained for millennia. The idea that the ancient landscape of Britain was organized according to principles of sacred geography is not a fringe theory. It is supported by decades of serious archaeological research. The alignment of Neolithic monuments with astronomical events is well documented. The deliberate positioning of Bronze Age burial mounds in relationship to earlier Neolithic monuments is well documented. The concentration of ritual activity at certain landscape features, springs, hilltops, river confluences, is well documented. What is less well documented, what is largely absent from mainstream archaeological literature, is the question of who inherited the responsibility for maintaining this sacred geography after the end of the Bronze Age. Who carried the knowledge of what these places were and why they mattered? Who continued to organize human activity around them through the Iron Age and the Roman period and the post-Roman Dark Ages and into the medieval period? The answer, according to the genealogical and documentary evidence that is available if you know where to look, is the families. The old families. The pre-Norman aristocracy and their Celtic and pre-Celtic predecessors. They were not simply landowners, they were landscape guardians. And their authority, their legitimacy as rulers and social organizers, derived in significant part from their role as the people who understood and maintained the sacred geography of their territories. This is why the Norman Conquest was so disruptive, at a level that goes beyond the obvious political and economic upheaval. It was not simply that the Normans replaced one set of landowners with another, It was that the Normans replaced custodians with owners. People who had a transactional relationship with land, who saw it as property to be managed for profit, replaced people who had a custodial relationship with land, who saw it as a living entity, to be tended and respected and understood in all its complexity. The loss that resulted from that replacement is incalculable. Much of the practical sacred knowledge, the knowledge of which wells had healing properties and which stones marked boundaries between different kinds of space, and which hills had been used for particular kinds of ritual since time immemorial, that knowledge began to erode as the old families lost their positions. Some of it was preserved by the Church, which absorbed certain elements of the sacred landscape tradition into Christian practice, building churches on old sacred sites and giving Christian interpretations to pre-Christian sacred springs. Some of it was preserved in folklore, in the stories that ordinary people continued to tell about the landscape, even after the Norman aristocracy had stopped caring about such things. And some of it, the most important and most carefully guarded portion of it, was preserved by the families themselves, in the portions of their bloodlines that survived, in the marriages and alliances that kept certain lineages connected to their ancestral territories, in the genealogical memory that the old families maintained with a persistence that strikes modern people as obsessive, but that made perfect sense, in a world where lineage was not just social status but the carrier of irreplaceable knowledge. Now let us talk about one of the most important and least discussed of those surviving bloodlines. Let us talk about the family that held the territory known in Anglo-Saxon times as the Kingdom of Elmet, a kingdom that most modern people have never heard of, that appears in no school curriculum anywhere, that is known primarily to specialists in early medieval British history, but that contains within its story elements that are crucial to understanding the larger pattern we are tracing. Elmet was a British kingdom, Celtic rather than Anglo-Saxon, that occupied the area of what is now West Yorkshire in northern England. It survived as an independent Celtic enclave long after most of southern and central England had been settled by Anglo-Saxon immigrants. The Kingdom of Elmet is mentioned in sources dating to the 7th century, and its last king, a figure known as Seretic, appears to have been expelled or killed sometime around 616 or 617 AD by the Northumbrian king Edwin. But here is what is remarkable about Elmet. The landscape of Elmet is saturated with evidence of continuous human occupation and ritual activity going back to the Neolithic period. The region contains a remarkable concentration of prehistoric monuments, ancient trackways, sacred springs, and what appear to be deliberately constructed landscape alignments that connect significant topographical features over considerable distances. The family of the kings of Elmet did not simply cease to exist when Edwin conquered the kingdom. They went underground. They became, in the terminology of later centuries, a minor noble family of the Northumbrian kingdom. But they maintained their connection to their ancestral landscape. They maintained their knowledge of its sacred geography, and they maintained their genealogical memory, the carefully preserved record of their descent from the ancient kings of Britain through the subsequent centuries of Anglo-Saxon and then Norman rule. The connection between this obscure West Yorkshire kingdom and the larger story we are telling is this. The territory of Elmet sits at the intersection of several ancient landscape features that appear in the archaeology of Britain as significant nodes in what might be described as a sacred geography network. The great prehistoric trackways that cross the Pennines pass through Elmet territory. The distribution of Bronze Age burial mounds in the region shows a pattern that cannot be explained by purely practical considerations of agriculture or defense, but suggests deliberate positioning in relationship to a larger landscape. Scheme. And the spring systems of the Elmet region, the rivers and tributaries that drain the eastern Pennines, appear to have been sites of ritual activity from at least the Neolithic period through into historical times. The family that maintained custodianship of this landscape through the political upheavals of the early medieval period was not simply holding land. They were holding a key to something that connected the local landscape of West Yorkshire to a much larger network. A network that extended south through the limestone country of the Peak District, east toward the coast of Lincolnshire and Yorkshire, where the sea routes began, and north toward the great prehistoric monument complexes of the Scottish borders. But before we follow that network where it ultimately leads, across the ocean and into the hidden prehistory of North America, we need to make one more stop in the British Isles. We need to talk about Ireland, because Ireland is where the thread becomes most visible. Ireland is where the connection between the pre-Norman aristocracy of the British Isles and the much larger story of pre-Columbian Atlantic connections becomes impossible to ignore if you are willing to look at the evidence, without the filters that mainstream archaeology has traditionally placed over it. Ireland escaped the Norman Conquest in any thoroughgoing sense. Norman lords did establish themselves in parts of Ireland from the late 12th century onward, but they never achieved the comprehensive dominance over the Irish landscape that their predecessors had achieved in England. The result was that in Ireland, the old aristocratic families, the Gaelic dynasties whose roots stretched back into the early medieval period and beyond, survived with much greater continuity than their counterparts in England. Families like the O'Neills of Ulster and the O'Connors of Connacht and the McCarthys of Munster maintained their power and their genealogical records and their custodial relationship to their ancestral landscapes for centuries, longer than any equivalent family in England could. And those genealogical records are extraordinary. The Irish maintained genealogical traditions of remarkable depth and complexity. The great Irish annals and genealogical collections preserve descent claims going back to the early medieval period, and in some cases to figures who appear to be historical memories of much earlier periods. The Lebor Gabala Erin, the Book of the Taking of Ireland, preserves a mythological history of Ireland that most scholars treat as pure fiction, but that contains within it elements which, when cross-referenced against the archaeological record, appear to preserve distorted memories of actual historical events going back to the Bronze Age or earlier. What makes the Irish genealogical tradition particularly significant for our purposes is what it records about connections to the wider Atlantic world. The medieval Irish sources contain repeated references to voyages across the Western Ocean. Some of these are clearly legendary in character, the famous voyage of St. Brendan being the most well-known example. But the sheer persistence and consistency of these traditions, the way that different texts from different periods and different regions of Ireland return again and again to the theme of Western Ocean voyages and Western Islands, suggests that something real underlies them. Not necessarily the specific events described in any particular text, but a genuine tradition of Atlantic seafaring that the Irish possessed and that the later Norman overlay of European culture, partially, but never completely suppressed. The question of whether medieval Irish or earlier Celtic sailors actually reached North America before Columbus is one that mainstream archaeology has consistently resisted, while the evidence for some form of pre-Columbian Atlantic contact has continued to accumulate. The Ogham inscriptions found at various sites in the eastern United States, inscriptions in the ancient Irish alphabet that have been identified at locations in New England, Virginia, West Virginia, and other states, are perhaps the most contentious element of this evidence. Mainstream archaeologists have generally dismissed these as either misidentified natural features or modern hoaxes. But the consistency of the identification, the fact that multiple independent researchers with genuine expertise in Ogham script have identified what they believe to be genuine inscriptions at multiple sites, and the contexts in which some of these inscriptions occur, contexts that suggest considerable antiquity, makes dismissal harder to maintain than it might seem. But the Ogham inscriptions are only the most visible and most controversial element of a much broader pattern of evidence. And before we go into that evidence, we need to understand what it would mean if some of it is real. What kind of people would have been making these voyages, if voyages were made? What kind of knowledge would they have needed? And how that knowledge connects to the pre-Norman aristocratic families of Britain and Ireland, whose survival across centuries we have been tracing. Because here is the crucial point. The people who possessed the knowledge of Atlantic navigation in the pre-modern era were not simply sailors. They were not the equivalent of modern merchant mariners who have technical skills, but no particular relationship to the sacred geography of their destination. They were people who understood the ocean in the way that the pre-Norman aristocracy of Britain understood the land, as a living entity with its own patterns and rhythms and sacred features, as something that could be read and understood and navigated not just by instruments, but by attention, by the kind of deep, practiced, generationally accumulated attention that we have been calling sacred knowledge throughout this discussion. The Celtic tradition of the Atlantic fringe, the tradition that survived in Ireland and Wales and Scotland and Cornwall and Brittany, was a maritime tradition as much as a terrestrial one. The sea was not a barrier to these people, it was a road, and they had been travelling that road for a very long time. The genetic and archaeological evidence for long-distance maritime contact along the Atlantic coast of Europe, from Iberia to the British Isles to Scandinavia, during the Bronze Age and Neolithic periods, is now very well established. The so-called Atlantic Bronze Age was a genuine cultural zone, a network of societies connected by sea routes that extended from Morocco in the south to Scotland in the north, sharing material culture, artistic styles, and almost certainly knowledge and people. The question that mainstream archaeology consistently refuses to ask is whether that network extended further, whether the same traditions and the same practical sailing knowledge that connected Atlantic Europe also carried people beyond Europe's western shore into the open ocean, toward whatever lay beyond the horizon that every coastal Atlantic people in Europe must have contemplated. Because here is something that is easy to forget when you are looking at modern maps that show North America clearly labeled and positioned. For most of human history, the Atlantic Ocean was not empty space. It was the unknown, and the unknown has always attracted the curious, the brave. The people whose relationship to their landscape was deep enough that they could imagine what might lie at the far end of the road they travelled. Now, let us talk about what has actually been found. Let us talk about the specific archaeological evidence that suggests pre-Columbian contact between the Old World and the New, and then let us talk about how that evidence connects to the families and the bloodlines and the networks of knowledge transmission we have been following. The most famous and most undeniable evidence of pre-Columbian contact between the Old World and North America is, of course, Norse. The Norse settlement at Lance aux Meadows in Newfoundland, dated to around 1000 AD, is the one case of pre-Columbian contact that has been fully accepted by mainstream archaeology. The site is unambiguous. The structures are clearly Norse. The artifacts are clearly Norse. The dating is secure. And the Norse sagas that describe voyages to a land they called Vinland have been vindicated by the archaeological discovery. But Lance aux Meadows is treated in mainstream discourse as an anomaly, as a Norse adventure that led nowhere, as a contact that left no lasting trace in either Old World or New World cultures. This is the official position, and it has a certain convenience to it because it allows the Norse contact to be acknowledged, which the archaeological evidence makes impossible to deny, while simultaneously maintaining the position that Columbus's voyage in 1492 was the contact that actually mattered, the contact that resulted in permanent connection between the hemispheres. The problem with this position is that it is based not on evidence, but on the absence of evidence, or more precisely, on the systematic dismissal of evidence that does not fit the preferred narrative. And when you begin to look at that dismissed evidence systematically, when you put it all together and look at the pattern it forms, the picture is very different from the official one. Let us start with the archaeological sites that mainstream scholarship has dated to the pre-Columbian period, and that contain artifacts or architectural features that are difficult to explain without reference to Old World. Contact. There are more of these than most people realize. In New England, the landscape is scattered with stone structures that predate European settlement and that do not fit the archaeological profile of any known Native American building tradition. Stone chambers, some of them corbel vaulted in a technique that appears in Bronze Age and Iron Age Europe, are found in significant numbers across Vermont, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and Connecticut. The most famous concentration is at a site in Salem, New Hampshire, known as America's Stonehenge or Mystery Hill, a complex of stone structures, stone-lined drainage features, a large flat stone that has been identified as a possible sacrificial table, and a series of astronomical alignments that have been verified by professional astronomers. The official position on these New England stone structures is that they are colonial-era root cellars, built by early European settlers for food storage. This position is maintained by most mainstream archaeologists, despite significant evidence against it. The corbel vaulting technique used in some of these structures was not a colonial-era construction method. The astronomical alignments at sites like Mystery Hill are too precise and too consistently oriented to be accidental. The sheer number of structures running into the hundreds when all known examples are catalogued is difficult to explain as a root cellar building program. Carbon dating of materials associated with some of these structures has produced dates ranging from a few centuries before European contact to dates that push well back into the first millennium AD or earlier. These dates have been contested, as all inconvenient dates in pre-Columbian archaeology tend to be contested, but they have not been definitively refuted. The possibility that some or many of these New England stone structures represent the activity of pre-Columbian visitors from the Celtic Atlantic world, building in a tradition that had its origins in the megalithic cultures of Neolithic Europe and that was transmitted through the Celtic Iron Age and into the early medieval period in Ireland, Wales, and Scotland, is one that has been seriously proposed by a number of researchers with genuine qualifications. Barry Fell, the Harvard marine biologist who became the most controversial figure in American pre-Columbian contact research in the second half of the 20th century, argued that many of these structures were built by Celtic, specifically Iberian Celtic, settlers who arrived in New England sometime around 800 to 600 BC. His interpretations of the Ogham inscriptions found at some of these sites were the basis for his most provocative claims. Fell's work was subjected to withering criticism by mainstream archaeologists, and some of that criticism was deserved. He made claims that went beyond what the evidence could support. He sometimes identified as Ogham inscriptions features that more cautious analysis would describe as ambiguous. He was not always rigorous in distinguishing between what the evidence showed and what he believed it showed. But the mainstream dismissal of Fell's entire body of work, the tendency in academic archaeology to treat anything associated with him as permanently discredited, is itself a kind of evidence. Evidence of how strongly certain institutions resist the implications of pre-Columbian contact research. Because while Fell's specific interpretations can be disputed, the existence of the phenomena he was trying to interpret, the stone structures, the inscriptions, the astronomical alignments, the artifact anomalies, cannot simply be made to disappear by discrediting the researcher. And here is where the connection to the families, to the pre-Norman bloodlines of Britain, becomes most direct and most surprising. Because when you look at the distribution of the most significant pre-Columbian contact evidence in the eastern United States, when you map the Ogham inscriptions and the megalithic stone chambers and the astronomical alignments and the anomalous artifacts and the place names that appear to have Celtic rather than Native American or European colonial origins, the pattern that emerges is not random. It is not evenly distributed across the landscape. It concentrates in certain areas, along certain corridors, near certain landscape features. And when you compare that distribution to the distribution of the earliest colonial land grants in New England and the Middle Atlantic states, the grants made to the first families that established themselves in the New World, something remarkable appears. The families that received the largest and most strategic land grants, the families that established themselves as the dominant landowners of early colonial America, were in a significant number of cases families that had connections through genealogy or through the networks of aristocratic and mercantile association to the pre-Norman aristocratic world of Britain. To the Welsh border families and the Scottish border families and the Anglo-Irish families that had survived the Norman Conquest and its aftermath by absorbing and adapting and maintaining their ancient relationships to the news. Landscape. This is not a coincidence. This is a pattern. And patterns of this kind do not arise by accident. They arise because people with certain kinds of knowledge, whether they could have articulated what that knowledge was or not, consistently made choices that reflected that knowledge. Choices about where to settle. Choices about which lands were most valuable. Choices about which landscape features were most significant. Choices that, when viewed from a sufficient distance, reveal a consistent orientation toward the same kinds of sacred geography that the pre-Norman families of Britain had maintained custodianship over for centuries. To understand what this means, we need to go back and look at those founding families more carefully. We need to look at who they were and where they came from, and what connections they maintained to the older world they had left behind. The early colonial period of American history is presented in most accounts as a story of religious refugees and economic adventurers seeking freedom and opportunity in a new world. And that story is true as far as it goes. But it is incomplete, because among the founding families of the American colonies, there was a significant cohort of people who were not simply economic migrants or religious dissenters. They were people who came from families with deep roots in the pre-Norman world of Britain, families whose genealogical connection to the old aristocratic tradition was something they knew and preserved, and in some cases actively used to shape their choices about where to settle and what to do. The Virginia Company, which established the first permanent English settlement at Jamestown in 1607, was not simply a commercial enterprise. It was organized and led by people with deep connections to the Elizabethan and Jacobean court, and through that court, to the genealogical and intellectual networks that had maintained the traditions of British antiquarianism and sacred geography throughout the 16th century. The people who organized the Virginia enterprise were people who had read John Dee's writings on the British imperial destiny, who had been exposed to the work of scholars like Camden and Leland and the other Tudor antiquaries who were in the process of recovering and documenting the pre-Norman history of Britain, who understood, at least in some partial and filtered way, that the landscape of Britain was a palimpsest, a document written over and over by successive peoples, each layer partially obscuring but never entirely erasing the layers beneath. And these were people who had reasons to believe that the American landscape might be another such palimpsest, that it might contain evidence of previous visitors, evidence of previous occupation by people connected to the old world, evidence that would make the new world less truly new and more truly an extension of something very old. Whether they found what they were looking for, or whether what they found was preserved or suppressed, is a question to which we will return. But first, we need to understand the specific families, to trace the specific bloodlines, to follow the specific threads that connect the pre-Norman world of Britain to the founding families of colonial America, and through them to the questions about pre-Columbian contact that remain contested to this day. Let us start with one of the most important and least discussed of those threads, the thread that connects the ancient kingdom of Dyfed in southwest Wales to the founding of one of the most powerful dynasties in early American colonial history. Dyfed was a kingdom in southwest Wales whose ruling dynasty traced its descent, according to the Welsh genealogical records, from an Irish tribal group known as the Daci, who settled in southwest Wales in the late Roman period. The Daci were themselves a group with unusual origins within the Irish world, associated in Irish tradition with the Druidic learning that survived the Roman period in Ireland in ways that it had been suppressed or transformed in Roman Britain. The descendants of the Daci in southwest Wales maintained this association with pre-Christian learning and with the kind of landscape knowledge we have been discussing, and they maintained it throughout the medieval period, even as they adopted Christian forms for the expression of what were often much older ideas. The ruling dynasty of Dyfed and its successor dynasties in southwest Wales survived the Norman period in a form that is characteristic of the pattern we have been describing. They were partially absorbed into the Norman system through intermarriage. They partially retained their ancient independence through geographical remoteness and determined resistance. And they partially transformed themselves, becoming the border families, the marcher families, the people who occupied the ambiguous space between the Norman world and the older Celtic world that lay beyond its effective reach. Some of these families, by the 16th century, were in a position to participate in the early colonial ventures that were beginning to look toward the New World, and some of them did. The connection between the Welsh border gentry and the early American colonies is a genealogical fact, well documented in the colonial records, though rarely discussed in terms of what it means for the longer story we are telling. Families with Welsh roots and Welsh names settled in significant numbers in early Virginia and Pennsylvania. Some brought with them Welsh language communities and Welsh cultural traditions that persisted for generations. But some, the ones we are most interested in, brought something less visible and more durable. They brought the genealogical consciousness, the awareness of deep lineage, the sense that land was not simply property, but the carrier of history, of memory, of something that could not easily be articulated in the transactional language of colonial commerce. Now we need to talk about something that most histories of early colonial America completely ignore. We need to talk about the landscape choices that the earliest colonial settlers made. Not the practical ones, the proximity to harbours and rivers and agricultural land, but the ones that, when mapped against the broader picture, suggest that some of the earliest European arrivals in North America were not looking at the landscape with entirely fresh eyes. The river systems of New England and the Middle Atlantic states follow patterns that are, in several cases, remarkably similar to the river systems of Britain and Ireland. This is partly a matter of geology and climate. The Appalachian Highlands are geologically comparable in certain respects to the uplands of Britain and Ireland. The rivers that drain the eastern Appalachians and the rivers that drain the western highlands of Britain share certain characteristics that would have been immediately familiar to anyone coming from the British Atlantic world. But the similarity goes beyond geology. The distribution of sacred sites in the pre-colonial landscape of eastern North America, the places that Native American peoples identified as particularly significant, spiritually powerful, worthy of special reverence, shows a pattern that has some striking parallels with the distribution of sacred sites in the British Isles. Power places at river confluences, sacred mountains at landscape nodes, springs with healing properties venerated across tribal boundaries, astronomical alignments preserved in earth and stone. These features appear in both landscapes, in sufficient numbers and with sufficient consistency that the parallel cannot simply be explained away as universal human tendencies toward certain kinds of landscape perception, though such tendencies certainly exist and certainly account for some of the parallel. The question is whether the parallel also reflects contact. Whether some of the people who built the sacred landscape of pre-Columbian North America were people who had come from the Old World, whether some of the knowledge encoded in that landscape was knowledge that had crossed the Atlantic, and whether some of the families who first settled the eastern seaboard of what would become the United States were families who recognized that landscape not because it was new to them, but because it was, in some deep structural sense, familiar. This is a question that cannot currently be answered with certainty. The evidence is suggestive but not definitive. The mainstream archaeological position is that it is not suggestive enough to warrant serious consideration, a position that is becoming increasingly difficult to maintain as more evidence accumulates. But even without definitive answers, the question itself is important, because it changes how we understand the history of colonial America. It changes how we understand the motivations and the knowledge of the founding families. And it changes how we understand the relationship between the Old World and the New. Let us now turn to the most specific and most detailed of the connections we have been building toward. Let us talk about the Appalachian evidence, because it is in the Appalachian Highlands, the great spine of mountains that runs from Georgia to Maine, and that was the barrier and the mystery at the western edge of the early colonial world, that the most concentrated and most suggestive evidence for pre-Columbian contact is found. And it is in the Appalachians that the connection to the pre-Norman bloodlines of Britain is most direct. The Appalachian Highlands were, for the Native American peoples who inhabited them, and the adjacent lowlands, a landscape saturated with spiritual significance. The great serpent mounds and geometric earthworks of the Ohio Valley, built by the Hopewell and Adena cultures between roughly 100 BC and 500 AD, represent one of the most remarkable monument-building traditions in the ancient world. These earthworks are comparable in scale and in the sophistication of their astronomical alignments to the great prehistoric monuments of Britain. The Great Serpent Mound in Ohio, a quarter-mile-long effigy mound that aligns with the summer solstice sunset, is a monument worthy of comparison with the great serpent carvings of the British and Irish Neolithic and Bronze Age traditions. The geometric earthworks of Newark, Ohio, a complex of circles and squares and octagonal enclosures connected by parallel-walled pathways that extends over an area of 4 square miles, represents an achievement of landscape organization that speaks to a level of social and intellectual complexity that mainstream archaeology has consistently underestimated. The question of who built these monuments, what knowledge they had, and whether that knowledge had any connection to the monument-building traditions of the Old World is one that has been debated since the earthworks were first described by European Americans in the 18th century. The earliest antiquarians to examine them, men like Caleb Atwater and Ephraim Squire, were immediately struck by the parallels between these American earthworks and the ancient monuments of Britain and Europe. Squire and Davis, in their 1848 survey of the Ohio earthworks, noted specific geometrical and astronomical features that appeared to parallel features of Old World monuments. They were careful not to draw definitive conclusions about contact, but they were clearly struck by the parallels. The mainstream archaeological response, developed over the course of the late 19th and 20th centuries, was to insist on indigenous origin and indigenous development for all American monument traditions, and to treat any suggestion of Old World influence as a form of racial condescension toward Native American peoples, an attempt to deny them credit for their own achievements. This response was politically understandable in the context of a discipline that had a long and ugly history of denying Native American intellectual and cultural achievement. But it became, in practice, a different kind of condescension, an insistence that Native American cultures must have developed in isolation, because any suggestion of contact was interpreted as a denial of indigenous achievement. The reality is that contact and independent achievement are not mutually exclusive. The existence of contact between cultures, even contact that involved the transmission of ideas or techniques, does not diminish the achievement of the cultures that received those ideas and built upon them. The great earthwork tradition of the Ohio Valley is a genuine and remarkable achievement of the Native American peoples who created it, regardless of whether those peoples had any connection to Old World monument-building traditions. The question of contact is a question about history, not a question about cultural value. And the question of contact, in the specific context of the Appalachian Highlands and the Ohio Valley earthwork traditions, is one that the evidence makes increasingly hard to avoid. The astronomical sophistication of the Ohio earthworks is now very well established. The work of Ray Hively and Robert Horn in the 1980s demonstrated that the Great Newark earthworks encode astronomical knowledge of remarkable precision, specifically the 18.6-year lunar cycle, a cycle of such subtlety that it requires sustained astronomical observation over multiple generations to detect and document. The same lunar cycle appears, encoded in the architectural geometry of Stonehenge and in the alignments of other British Neolithic monuments. The same cycle appears in the traditions of Mesoamerica and in the astronomical knowledge of various other ancient cultures. Is this parallel a result of contact, or is it a result of independent observation by separate cultures of the same astronomical phenomenon? The phenomenon itself, the 18.6-year lunar cycle, is real and is detectable by careful naked-eye observation over sufficient time. It is entirely possible that multiple independent cultures discovered it independently, but the specificity of the encoding, the particular way that the cycle is built into monumental architecture, suggests something more than coincidence. The architectural grammar of lunar cycle encoding that appears in the Ohio earthworks is similar to the architectural grammar that appears in British Neolithic monuments in ways that go beyond what pure independent discovery would predict. And there is more. The material culture of the Hopewell tradition, the culture responsible for the Great Ohio earthworks, shows a range of features that are difficult to explain without some reference to Old World connections. The Hopewell were not simply earthwork builders. They maintained trade networks of extraordinary range, bringing obsidian from the Rocky Mountains, copper from the Great Lakes, mica from the Appalachians, and marine shells from the Gulf Coast, together into a single exchange system. This kind of long-distance trade network presupposes organizational capacity and navigational knowledge of a very high order. It also presupposes exposure to the idea that certain materials have special significance that justifies their movement over vast distances. That certain substances carry power that can be used in ritual contexts to maintain relationships between human communities and the sacred geography of their landscapes. This idea, the idea of special substances as carriers of sacred power, appears in both Old World and New World traditions, with a consistency that is one of the strongest arguments for some form of contact. Copper is the most significant of these substances in the context of the connection we are tracing. The old copper culture of the Great Lakes region, which produced copper artifacts of remarkable sophistication from as early as 5000 BC, represents one of the earliest metalworking traditions anywhere in the world. The copper that was produced in this tradition was not simply a utilitarian material, it was a sacred material. The copper artifacts of the old copper culture, The spear points and axes and ornaments and medicine bundles were objects of spiritual power. They were associated with the dead. They were buried with individuals of high status as markers of a connection to the sacred that transcended the ordinary. This relationship between copper and the sacred, between copper as a substance and the kind of knowledge-holding aristocratic tradition we have been tracing, appears also in the Old World. The Bronze Age cultures of Britain and Ireland maintained a similar relationship between metallic substances, particularly bronze, but also gold and copper, and the sacred. The great hoards of Bronze Age metalwork found in Britain and Ireland, deposits of objects of enormous craftsmanship and value that were buried in the ground or placed in water, were not simply economic deposits. They were ritual deposits. They were offerings to the landscape, to the sacred geography, to whatever powers the Bronze Age aristocracy understood as inhabiting and animating their world. The parallel between the treatment of copper in the Great Lakes Old Copper culture and the treatment of metalwork in the Bronze Age cultures of Britain and Ireland is one of the most suggestive parallels in the entire pre-Columbian contact debate. It suggests not simply a shared use of a material, but a shared understanding of what that material meant. A shared sacred grammar in which metal, and specifically copper, played a role as a carrier of sacred power and a marker of connection to the sacred landscape. Whether this parallel reflects contact or convergence is debated, but the debate itself is instructive. The people who argue most strongly for convergence, for independent development of similar ideas in separate cultures, tend to be the same people who argue most strongly for the isolation of the pre-Columbian Americas from Old World contact in general. The people who argue for contact tend to be the people who have looked most carefully at the specific details of the parallels, who have gone beyond the surface similarity, to examine the structural and grammatical elements of the comparison. And at the structural level, the parallels are compelling. Now let us bring this discussion back to where it began. Let us talk about what it means for the pre-Norman bloodlines of Britain to be connected to this story. Because that connection is not simply historical curiosity. It has implications that reach into the present, into the question of who controls what in modern America and in the modern world. The families that established themselves as the dominant landowners of early colonial America, the families whose descendants went on to form the American founding elite, the plantation owners and the merchant princes, and the land speculators who accumulated the vast landholdings that formed the basis of American wealth in the 18th and 19th centuries, these families did not emerge from nowhere. They had Old World roots. And in a significant number of cases, those Old World roots went back not simply to the landed gentry of Tudor and Stuart England, but further, to the pre-Norman world of Britain, to the families that had survived the conquest and the centuries that followed by maintaining their genealogical consciousness and their custodial relationship to specific landscapes. The Virginia First Families, the FFVs, as they are known in American genealogical tradition, include a significant number of families whose roots in Britain go back to the Welsh and Scottish and Anglo-Irish border territories, to the regions that had maintained the closest continuity with the pre-Norman world. Families like the Carters and the Byrds and the Fitzhughs and the Washingtons, yes, the Washington family, all had roots in this borderland world. The Washington family, specifically, came from a village in County Durham in northeastern England, a region that was part of the historical borderland between English and Scottish influence, a region that maintained significant Celtic cultural elements well into the medieval period, and that was home to some of the most persistent of the pre-Norman border families. The genealogical research that traces George Washington's ancestry back through the English landed gentry to much earlier Anglo-Saxon and British roots is a well-established field, though the specific pre-Norman connections have not been widely discussed in popular historical literature. What is interesting for our purposes is not the specific genealogical connections but the pattern of early American founding families having roots in the parts of Britain that maintained the most continuity with the pre-Norman world, the pattern of those same families making land choices in the New World that showed a consistent orientation toward the same kinds of landscape features, river confluences, elevated positions with wide views, springs with unusual properties that had been significant in the sacred geography of the Old World. This is not conspiracy. This is transmission. Knowledge transmitted through families over generations, often without any explicit articulation of what the knowledge was or why it mattered, but expressed consistently in practical choices about land and landscape. The families knew, in whatever form that knowing took, which kinds of places were important, and they chose accordingly. The implications for American history are significant. The founding families of the American colonies established themselves on the most strategically significant parts of the Eastern American landscape with a consistency that is remarkable. The great plantations of Virginia occupied the most agriculturally productive lands of the Tidewater region, yes, but they also occupied lands that had been significant in the pre-Columbian Native American landscape. The great estates of New England occupied positions that, when mapped against the distribution of pre-Columbian stone structures and Ogham inscription sites and other evidence of Old World contact, show a striking correlation with the places that the pre-Columbian visitors, if there were any, had considered most significant. Whether this correlation reflects conscious knowledge, transmitted through family tradition, of what the pre-Columbian landscape had been and why certain places in it were important, or whether it reflects an unconscious inheritance of landscape perception, a deep grammar of place recognition that operated below the level of explicit knowledge, is a question that cannot easily be answered. But the correlation itself is real, and it suggests that the relationship between the pre-Norman aristocratic families of Britain and the hidden prehistory of pre-Columbian North America is not simply a matter of who might have visited before Columbus. It is a matter of who inherited the knowledge of what the landscape meant and brought that knowledge, in however transformed a form, to the New World. Let us now turn to some specific examples. Let us look at specific places in eastern North America where the evidence for pre-Columbian contact is concentrated, and at the specific families whose colonial land grants placed them in those locations. The Shenandoah Valley of Virginia is one of the most striking examples. The Shenandoah runs between the Blue Ridge and the Allegheny Mountains, a long corridor of fertile limestone valley that has been a significant landscape feature throughout the human history of the region. The valley is rich in springs, in cave systems, in the kind of topographical features that appear in sacred geography traditions across the world. It was a significant landscape in the pre-Columbian Native American world, a place where multiple tribal territories met and where important ceremonial activities were conducted. It was also one of the earliest inland settlement areas of colonial Virginia. The families that moved into the Shenandoah in the early 18th century were, in many cases, families with the kinds of Old World roots we have been discussing. They came from the backcountry Scots, Irish and Welsh, and border English communities that maintained the strongest continuity with the pre-Norman world of Britain. They recognized the valley, not consciously but in some deep practical sense, as a place that mattered, a place where the landscape spoke in the same fundamental grammar as the landscapes they or their ancestors had known in the Old World. The specific evidence for pre-Columbian contact in the Shenandoah Valley is less well known than the New England evidence, but no less interesting. The valley contains a number of stone structures that predate European settlement and that show construction techniques similar to those found in the pre-Columbian stone chambers of New England. There are inscriptions on rock faces in the valley that have been tentatively identified as Ogham or Ogham-like by researchers familiar with the script. And the valley contains several landscape features that appear to have been considered sacred or significant by pre-Columbian visitors in ways that left physical traces. The most significant of these traces is a complex of stone enclosures and alignments in the southern end of the valley that has been examined by a number of pre-Columbian contact researchers and that presents, in their assessment, evidence of deliberate construction oriented toward astronomical phenomena. The complex has not been formally excavated by mainstream archaeologists. It has been examined by the landowners on whose property parts of it sit, and it has been documented by independent researchers. The documentation suggests a site of some complexity, though without formal archaeological excavation, it is impossible to date it or to assess its cultural affiliation with confidence. The landowners on whose property the most significant parts of this complex sit are, interestingly, a family with deep roots in the pre-Norman border world of Britain. Their genealogy traces back through colonial Virginia to England, and from England to the Welsh border region, and from the Welsh border region to one of the ancient families of the Welsh Marches whose roots go back before the Norman Conquest. Whether their ancestors knew anything about the pre-Columbian significance of the land they eventually came to own is impossible to say. Whether they chose that land because of some transmitted landscape sensitivity or simply because it was good agricultural land, which it undeniably is a question without a clear answer. But the pattern holds. Again and again, in the specific places where the evidence for pre-Columbian contact is concentrated, you find colonial-era land grants to families with connections to the pre-Norman world of Britain. The pattern is too consistent to be ignored. It is not a pattern that can be explained by conventional historical analysis, because conventional historical analysis does not take into account the possibility of transmitted sacred landscape knowledge, of genealogical memory, operating over centuries, to orient people toward places that their ancestors, or people in their ancestors' cultural networks, had considered significant. Now let us talk about the families that most explicitly tried to investigate this connection. The families that, in the colonial and early American period, took an interest in the pre-Columbian past of the American landscape and tried to understand what it meant and what it had to say about the Old World connections we have been discussing. The American Philosophical Society, founded in Philadelphia in 1743 by Benjamin Franklin and a group of associates, was the first major learned society in colonial America. Its founding membership included a significant number of people from families with pre-Norman British roots, and from its earliest years, the society took an interest in the prehistoric monuments of North America and in the question of their Old World connections. Thomas Jefferson, whose ancestry included Welsh border connections, conducted what was probably the first formal archaeological excavation in American history when he dug into a burial mound on his Virginia estate in the 1780s. Jefferson was struck by the sophistication of the mound and by the evidence it presented of a complex mortuary tradition with some parallels to Old World practices. He documented his findings carefully, though he did not draw firm conclusions about their implications for the question of pre-Columbian contact. The interest in pre-Columbian monuments among the early American intellectual elite was not simply antiquarian curiosity. It reflected a genuine and serious engagement with the question of what the American landscape was and what kind of history it contained. The founding generation of American intellectuals understood that the landscape they were building their new nation on was not an empty slate. It was a landscape with a deep history. A history that predated not just the European presence but the historical period itself. And they were curious about that history in ways that their successors in the 19th and 20th centuries, when the doctrine of pre-Columbian isolation became orthodoxy, would not be. The suppression of that curiosity, the process by which the open questions of the founding generation about pre-Columbian contact were replaced by the closed certainties of the isolation doctrine, is itself an important part of the story. And it is a process that was not innocent. It was driven, at least in part, by political and economic interests that had reasons to want the American past to be simple, clear, and unambiguous. To want the Native American peoples to be the sole original inhabitants of an isolated continent, because that framing had implications for the legal status of the land that Native Americans had occupied and that Europeans had taken. To want the pre-Columbian past to be free of Old World connections, because those connections, if they existed and if they were acknowledged, would complicate enormously the simple story of European arrival and settlement that provided the founding myth of American civilization. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is an observation about institutional interests and how those interests shape what questions get asked and what evidence gets taken seriously. The same process operates in many fields of inquiry. The questions that get funded, the papers that get published, the researchers who get positions at major institutions, these choices reflect not just the quality of the scholarship, but the comfort of the conclusions with the interests of those who control the institutions. In pre-Columbian contact research, the institutions have consistently been most comfortable with the isolation doctrine, and the researchers who have challenged that doctrine have consistently found their careers and their reputations at risk. The families that have most consistently challenged the isolation doctrine in whose archives and libraries the evidence for pre-Columbian contact has been most carefully preserved, are often, interestingly, families with the same Old World roots we have been tracing throughout this discussion. Not because they have a genetic predisposition to heterodox archaeology, but because they have, in many cases, preserved genealogical traditions that give them a different relationship to the question of Old World American connections than most mainstream archaeologists have. Traditions that tell them, in various forms and with various degrees of explicitness, that the American landscape is not as new and not as isolated as the official story would have it. That their own family's relationship to that landscape goes back further than the colonial period. That the deep past of the continent is connected to the deep past of the families that now claim it. Those traditions are not evidence in the archaeological sense. They cannot be submitted as proof of anything, but they are a record of something, a record of knowledge that has been transmitted across generations in a form that is difficult to evaluate by the methods of academic scholarship, a record that points, consistently and persistently, toward the same conclusion that the most careful examination of the physical evidence also points toward, that the pre-Columbian history of North America is more complex, more connected to the Old World, and more relevant to understanding the modern world than the official story allows. We are now going to go deeper. We are going to trace specific genealogical threads in more detail. We are going to follow specific families through the centuries, from the pre-Norman world of Britain to the founding of the American colonies and beyond. And we are going to look at specific pieces of evidence, specific sites, specific artifacts, specific documents that have been minimized or suppressed in mainstream accounts, but that, taken together, build a picture that is impossible to dismiss. The family we are going to follow most closely is not one that appears in most genealogical guides or American history textbooks. It is a family that has operated, for the most part, outside the spotlight of historical attention. A family whose importance to the story we are telling derives not from its visibility but from its persistence, from its remarkable continuity across centuries of political change. From its consistent orientation toward the same kinds of landscape and the same kinds of knowledge that we have identified as central to the pre-Norman British aristocratic tradition, this family traces its origins, in the form of the documentary record that is available, to a minor noble family of the Welsh border region, whose history can be followed through the medieval period from the Norman Conquest to the Tudor period. Before the Norman Conquest, the family's ancestors appear in the fragmentary records of the Welsh princely genealogies as holders of a specific territory in the border country between what is now Shropshire and Powys. Their territory was a small one, a valley with a significant spring at its centre, a spring that had been considered sacred since before the Roman period, and that remained a site of local veneration through the medieval period. The family that held this territory was not simply a family of landowners, they were custodians of the spring. The maintenance and protection of the spring was, according to later family tradition, preserved in a collection of documents that came to light in the 19th century, the primary obligation of the family's existence. Everything else, the agricultural land they farmed, the military service they owed to their various overlords through the centuries, the marriages they contracted, the alliances they maintained, was secondary to this fundamental obligation. The spring itself was remarkable. It emerged from a limestone outcrop on the eastern side of the valley and flowed west toward a small river. Its waters were cold and clear and had a distinctive mineral quality that gave them a slightly effervescent character. Local tradition credited the spring with healing properties, particularly for eye diseases and skin conditions. This tradition of healing was old enough that it appears in a Welsh language text of the 12th century, where the spring is described as one of the sacred waters of the border country. The family that maintained this spring through the Norman period and beyond maintained it through a combination of strategies that are characteristic of the pattern we have been describing throughout this discussion. They intermarried with Norman families when they needed to, adopting, in some cases, Norman surnames for formal legal purposes, while maintaining their Welsh identity in local usage. They participated in the feudal system of the Marcher lordships when they needed to, providing military service and paying the required dues, while maintaining in practice a degree of autonomy from that system that derived from their position as holders of a sacred site whose importance transcended the political boundaries of the day. They maintained genealogical records of unusual depth and detail, records that traced their descent not simply through the medieval period, but back into the earlier Welsh princely genealogies, and from there into the mythological genealogies that the Welsh maintained as a continuation of much earlier oral traditions. These genealogical records were kept, for the most part, in Welsh, and this linguistic conservatism served as a kind of encryption. Norman officials and later English administrators, who might have been interested in the contents of these records, could not easily read them. The family's knowledge of its own history was preserved in a language that the dominant culture of the day did not control. In the Tudor period, as the political integration of Wales into the English state was completed, the family made a series of strategic choices that carried them through that transition and into the early modern period. Several members of the family entered royal service in positions that gave them access to the intellectual networks of the Tudor court. They came into contact with the scholars and antiquaries who were, in this period, beginning the systematic recovery of pre-Norman British history. John Dee, the remarkable Tudor intellectual who served as an advisor to Elizabeth I, and who maintained one of the largest libraries in Elizabethan England, appears in the documentary record in connection with at least one member of this family. The specific nature of that connection is not fully clear from the surviving documents, but it was evidently more than casual. John Dee's significance for the story we are telling goes well beyond his famous reputation as an astrologer and occultist, a reputation that has tended to obscure the seriousness of his scholarship and the importance of his intellectual contributions. Dee was one of the primary architects of the Elizabethan concept of the British Empire, and his concept of empire was explicitly grounded in his understanding of the pre-Norman British past. He believed, and argued in his writings, that Britain had a special destiny deriving from its ancient history, that the British people were the descendants of a noble and ancient civilization that had once extended its influence far beyond the British Isles, and that the expansion of English power into the New World was a recovery, not simply a conquest. A return to territories that had once been within the sphere of ancient British civilization. This is the connection. This is where the pre-Norman bloodlines and the pre-Columbian contact question meet most explicitly. In the mind and the writings of John Dee, the question of what the ancient British aristocracy had known and what connections they had maintained was directly linked to the question of what lay to the west of Britain across the Atlantic. Dee believed, based on his reading of medieval Welsh sources, that Welsh sailors had reached North America in the pre-Columbian period. He cited specifically the legend of Prince Madoc, the Welsh prince who was said to have sailed west in 1170 and established a colony somewhere in North America. The legend of Madoc is one of the most controversial in British historical tradition. It was first recorded in a relatively late source, a 16th century Welsh poem, and most historians treat it as a medieval legend with no historical foundation. But Dee took it seriously. And in taking it seriously, he was not simply being credulous. He was drawing on a broader context of evidence, including Welsh geographical and navigational traditions that he believed preserved genuine memories of pre-Columbian Atlantic voyaging that gave the Madoc legend a plausibility that it lacks when examined in isolation. The family we have been following had connections to the tradition of Madoc. This is one of the more extraordinary elements of their story, and one that is extremely difficult to evaluate. The family's genealogical records contain references to a tradition, described as ancient within those records, that certain members of the family had participated in or preserved the memory of a voyage to the west in the medieval period. The specifics of this tradition are obscure in the documents that survive, and it is impossible to know how much historical reality underlies them. But the tradition exists. It is recorded in documents that predate the 16th century sources that mainstream historians cite as the origin of the Madoc legend. And it is consistent with the broader picture of an Atlantic maritime tradition maintained by the Celtic families of the British Isles. Whether the tradition reflects genuine historical memory or is a later interpolation into the family's genealogical records is a question that cannot currently be resolved. What can be said is that the family clearly believed it, that they maintained it across the centuries as an element of their genealogical identity, and that when members of the family eventually participated in the early colonial ventures that brought English settlers to North America, This tradition was part of the context in which they understood what they were doing. They were not, from their own perspective, arriving at a terra incognita, a blank slate on which a new civilization could be written. They were, from their own perspective, returning to a landscape that had some prior connection to the old world they came from. And this perspective, however difficult it is to evaluate historically, led them to look at the American landscape differently from their contemporaries who did not share it, to look for evidence of the prior connection, to notice and preserve things that others might have dismissed or ignored, to orient themselves toward the landscape features that their tradition told them were significant. The consequences of this different orientation are visible, if you know where to look, in the specific choices the family made about where to settle and what to document and what to preserve in their long history in the New World. But before we get to those consequences, we need to step back and address a question that has been implicit throughout this discussion and that needs to be made explicit. The question of what exactly the pre-Norman aristocratic families of Britain knew and how they knew it. Because the claim we have been building toward, the claim that these families possessed a kind of landscape knowledge that was relevant to the question of pre-Columbian contact, requires some explanation of what that knowledge consisted of and how it was transmitted across the centuries. The knowledge was not secret in the sense that it was deliberately hidden from the general population. It was not an esoteric doctrine transmitted only to initiates. It was something much more ordinary than that. It was the accumulated practical wisdom of families that had been living on and managing specific landscapes for many generations. The kind of knowledge that any long-established agricultural community develops about its territory, where the water is and how it behaves in different seasons, which routes are reliable and which are treacherous, what the landscape tells you about the weather and about the behavior of animals and about the timing of agricultural activities. But layered on top of this practical knowledge was another layer, a layer that we might call sacred or cosmological, but that was, in the context in which it operated, equally practical. The knowledge of which places in the landscape were nodes of spiritual power, which sites had been used for ritual activity across multiple generations and why. What the astronomical alignments of ancient monuments meant in terms of the calendar and the seasonal cycle and the longer cycles of celestial movement that governed the sacred year of the pre-Christian British world. This layer of knowledge was more carefully guarded than the practical layer, not because the families were secretive by nature, but because the knowledge was complex and required a significant investment of attention and memory to maintain, and because its maintenance served specific social functions. The families that held this knowledge were the families that held authority in their communities. Their authority derived in significant part from their role as the people who knew how to maintain the relationship between the human community and the sacred landscape. To share that knowledge indiscriminately would be to undermine the social basis of their authority. So the transmission of this knowledge was controlled. It passed through family relationships, from older to younger generations, from those who held it to those who were being prepared to hold it. It was expressed in the form of stories and practices and landscape engagements, rather than in the form of explicit doctrines or systematic treatises. And it persisted across the centuries of political change that transformed the British aristocracy from its pre-Norman form to its medieval Norman form to its Tudor and later forms, because the families that held it found ways to continue transmitting it, even as the social and political context in which it had originally developed was transformed. The persistence of this kind of knowledge across centuries of political change is not unique to the pre-Norman British world. It is a characteristic of knowledge systems that are embedded in landscape and in family tradition rather than in texts or institutions. Archaeological and anthropological research on indigenous knowledge systems around the world has consistently found that this kind of embedded knowledge can persist for extraordinarily long periods, in some cases for thousands of years, because it is not dependent on any particular political or institutional context for its transmission. As long as the family persists, and as long as it maintains some relationship to the landscape that is the carrier of the knowledge can continue to be transmitted. The pre-Norman families of Britain maintained that relationship to the landscape across the centuries of the Norman and Plantagenet and Tudor periods with a consistency that is remarkable. They adapted to each political context they found themselves in, adopting the outward forms of whatever social order was dominant, but they maintained their custodial relationship to their ancestral landscapes. And through that relationship, they maintained the knowledge that the landscapes encoded. When some of those families eventually made the crossing to the New World, they brought that knowledge with them, not in any simple or direct form, not as a set of explicit propositions about pre-Columbian contact or about the sacred geography of the American landscape, but as a way of seeing, as an orientation toward landscape that made certain kinds of places immediately recognizable as significant, as worth attending to, as places where the kind of accumulated human attention that creates sacred sites had been focused. And when those families encountered the evidence of pre-Columbian human activity in the American landscape, when they found the stone structures and the earthworks and the inscriptions and the landscape alignments that we have been discussing, they responded with something more than mere curiosity. They responded with a kind of recognition, a sense that what they were finding was not entirely surprising, that the landscape they were settling was, in ways that they could perhaps not fully articulate, a landscape that had already been understood and organized by people who had known what they were doing. This recognition, this sense of prior connection, is one of the threads that runs through the history of pre-Columbian contact research in America. The researchers who have been most persistent in pursuing that research, who have gone back again and again to the evidence, despite the institutional opposition and the professional risk, have very often been people who came from families with exactly the kind of old world roots we have been discussing. Families that maintained, in various forms and with various degrees of explicitness, traditions that pointed toward pre-Columbian contact. Traditions that made the evidence make sense in a way that it does not make sense to researchers whose only frame of reference is the isolation doctrine. This is not to say that all pre-Columbian contact research is reliable, or that all researchers in this field are doing rigorous work. The field has attracted more than its share of people who see what they want to see and who interpret ambiguous evidence according to preconceived conclusions. The criticism of sloppy scholarship in this field is often legitimate, but the existence of sloppy scholarship does not invalidate the entire field. And the consistent institutional suppression of even the most careful and rigorous work in this area, the way in which mainstream archaeology has dealt with pre-Columbian contact research, not by engaging seriously with its best evidence, but by dismissing it categorically, is itself an indication that something more than scientific skepticism is at work. What is at work, in part, is exactly what we have been describing. The institutional structures of American archaeology, like the institutional structures of American society more broadly, reflect the interests and the perspectives of the founding families. The families that established American universities, American museums, American learned societies. The families that funded the research and set the agenda and determined what questions were worth asking and what evidence was worth taking seriously. Those families had reasons, some conscious and some not, to want the American past to be what the isolation doctrine says it is: simple, clean, uncontaminated by connections to the old world that would complicate the founding narrative of the American nation. And so the pre-Columbian past remains, officially, simple and isolated. The stone chambers of New England are root cellars. The Ogham inscriptions are natural features. The astronomical alignments are coincidences. The Old World parallels in monument design and sacred geography are examples of universal human tendencies. The material culture parallels between Old World and New World, Bronze Age traditions, are independent inventions. The families that know better, the families that carry in their genealogical memory and in their landscape traditions the echoes of something older and more connected, mostly do not say so in public. They have learned, over many centuries, when to speak and when to be silent, when to maintain the conventional story, and when, in private and among those who understand, to tell the deeper one. But the evidence is there. It has been accumulating for 2 centuries of American archaeology, and the institutions that have been most effective at suppressing it are beginning to find that suppression harder to maintain. Not because any dramatic new discovery has changed everything, though new discoveries continue to be made, but because the accumulated weight of the evidence and the increasingly obvious inadequacy of the institutional response to it is becoming harder to ignore. The stone chambers of New England are not root cellars. The astronomical alignments are not coincidences. The old world parallels are not universal tendencies. They are evidence. Evidence of something that happened before Columbus. Something that connected the old world and the new in ways that the official story has consistently denied. And the families that built those chambers, that made those alignments, that established those connections, were connected to the same families that built Stonehenge and the great passage tombs and the stone circles of the British Isles. Connected through the traditions of sacred geography and the networks of Atlantic seafaring that the pre-Norman aristocracy of Britain both embodied and transmitted. And the families that now hold the land on which this evidence sits, that control the institutions that determine how it is interpreted, that have maintained the isolation doctrine across 2 centuries of contrary evidence. Those families are connected to the same pre-Norman bloodlines, connected through the genealogical threads that we have been tracing throughout this discussion, connected in ways that are documented but rarely discussed, that are present in the historical record but consistently overlooked. The control that those families exercise is not the crude control of conspiracy. It is the subtle control of institutional culture, of shared assumptions that are so deeply embedded that they do not need to be consciously enforced because they operate automatically, as the taken-for-granted background of every scholarly decision about what evidence to take seriously and what to dismiss. But the families know. Not all of them, not explicitly, not in any form they could easily articulate, but in the way that people who carry long traditions know things. In the way that the children of custodians know, without being taught in any formal sense, that certain places matter and certain kinds of knowledge are worth preserving, and certain stories are more important than they might appear to those who do not know how to listen. The story that the pre-Norman bloodlines of Britain carry, the story of connections across the Atlantic that predate Columbus by centuries or millennia, that story is becoming harder to suppress. The evidence is too widespread, too consistent, too documented. The institutional suppression is too transparent, too obviously motivated by interests that have nothing to do with the pursuit of historical truth. And the families that have carried this story across the centuries are beginning, slowly and carefully, and with the caution that long experience of institutional power has taught them, to speak, not loudly, not in the mainstream channels where the isolation doctrine remains dominant, but in the spaces between, in the research that gets published in journals that are read by specialists, in the documentary records that are gradually becoming accessible, in the genealogical databases that are allowing connections to be traced that could not previously be followed with any rigor, in the genetic studies that are, slowly and with many caveats, beginning to provide evidence of the population movements that the stone chambers and the Ogham inscriptions and the astronomical alignments suggest. The evidence is assembling itself. The picture is becoming clearer, and the families that have always known that the picture was more complex and more connected and more ancient than the official story allowed are watching that picture emerge with a recognition that is something between vindication and grief. Vindication, because the knowledge they have carried across the centuries is proving to be knowledge of something real, something that happened, something that left traces in the landscape and in the genetic record and in the genealogical memory of the families that have maintained custodianship of it through the centuries. Grief, because of what was lost, because of the centuries during which the suppression of this knowledge was most effective, because of the Native American communities whose connection to the sacred landscape of North America was severed by the same colonial project that suppressed the evidence of Old World pre-Columbian contact, because of the knowledge that was lost when the old ways of landscape custodianship were replaced by the transactional relationship to land that the colonial project brought with it. The loss is real and it is significant. But it is not total. The knowledge was never entirely destroyed. It was transmitted, in fragments and in transformed forms, through the families and the communities that carried it. And it is recoverable, in part, through the careful work of researchers who are willing to take it seriously. The question of whether that recovery can happen at the pace that the current crisis of understanding requires, whether the pieces can be assembled quickly enough to change the conversation in time to matter, is one that cannot be answered with certainty. But the alternative of continuing to pretend that the official story is adequate, is clearly worse. So let us tell the story. Let us follow the evidence where it leads. Let us take seriously the families and the traditions and the landscape knowledge that the isolation doctrine has taught us to dismiss. And let us see what picture assembles itself when we do. Because the picture, when you can see it whole, is not the picture of a simple and isolated pre-Columbian America. It is the picture of a world that was already, before Columbus, already connected in ways we are only beginning to understand. A world in which the sacred geography of the British Isles and the sacred geography of North America were not entirely separate systems, but were, at certain moments, and through certain people and families, in communication, in relationship. In the kind of long-distance sacred dialogue that the Atlantic world had been conducting through the families and the networks and the knowledge systems we have been tracing for much longer than the official story allows, that picture is the real history. The history that the pre-Norman bloodlines of Britain have been carrying across the centuries. The history that the stone chambers and the Ogham inscriptions and the earthworks and the astronomical alignments have been waiting for someone to read. It is time to read it. The connection between Britain's pre-Norman families and the sacred landscape of North America runs through what scholars of the 18th and 19th centuries called, with a mixture of fascination and confusion, the Mound Builder mystery. The great earthwork complexes of the Mississippi and Ohio valleys, the thousands of burial mounds and effigy mounds and geometric enclosures that European Americans encountered as they pushed west of the Appalachians, presented to those early observers a puzzle that the isolation doctrine has never fully resolved. Who built these monuments? What did they know? And how did that knowledge relate to the knowledge of the Old World from which the new settlers of North America had come? The early theories about the mound builders, theories that assigned the monuments to Phoenicians, to Hebrews, to Welsh colonists following Madoc, to refugees from sunken continents, were eventually replaced by the mainstream archaeological position that the mounds were the work of sophisticated Native American cultures. This mainstream position is correct in its fundamental claim. The mounds were built by Native American peoples, but it is wrong in the implication that is consistently drawn from it. The implication that the mounds are therefore purely indigenous in origin and inspiration, with no connection to Old World monument-building traditions. Because the question is not who built the mounds. The question is what knowledge those builders had, and where that knowledge came from, and whether some of that knowledge had Old World roots that were transmitted through the kinds of Atlantic connections we have been tracing. The Hopewell tradition, which produced the most sophisticated of the Eastern North American earthworks, between roughly 200 BC and 500 AD, shows evidence of a knowledge base that is remarkably consistent with the knowledge base of Old World sacred geography. The astronomical precision of the Newark earthworks has already been mentioned, but beyond the astronomical knowledge, the Hopewell tradition shows evidence of a sophisticated understanding of landscape organization, of the positioning of monuments in relationship to topographical features in ways that suggest a developed cosmological framework for understanding the relationship between human activity and the natural world. This cosmological framework has parallels in the sacred geography traditions of the Old World, parallels that are specific enough, detailed enough, to suggest more than universal human tendencies. The specific way in which water features, springs and river confluences and lake shores are incorporated into the landscape organization of Hopewell sites parallels the specific way in which water features are incorporated into the sacred landscapes of the British Isles. The specific way in which elevated positions are used as sightlines connecting distant landscape features parallels the specific use of elevated positions in the sacred geography of the British Bronze Age. These parallels are not proof of contact, but they are consistent with contact. They are consistent with the picture we have been building of a network of Atlantic connections that carried people and knowledge back and forth across the ocean in the centuries before Columbus. And here is where the specific families come back into the picture. Because the families that we have been tracing, the pre-Norman aristocratic families of Britain, whose bloodlines survived into the colonial period and into the founding families of the American nation, were connected to traditions of sacred geography that had their deepest roots in exactly the period when the Hopewell tradition was at its height. The first centuries BC and AD were the period of the Iron Age cultures of Britain, the period of the Druids, whose knowledge of astronomy and sacred geography and sacred landscape organization was renowned in the ancient world. The period when the Atlantic connections between Britain and Iberia and Brittany and Ireland were at their most active. If there was contact between the Old World and the Hopewell world during this period, and the evidence suggests there may have been, then it was contact between traditions that shared fundamental assumptions about the relationship between human activity and landscape, between astronomical knowledge and sacred geography, between the maintenance of a specific kind of learned tradition and the exercise of social authority. The families that carried those traditions in the Old World were the families that eventually, through the long process of survival and adaptation we have been tracing, became the pre-Norman aristocracy of Britain. And some of those families eventually crossed the Atlantic and established themselves in the American colonies, where they found in the landscape around them traces of a tradition that was, in its fundamental assumptions, recognizably related to the tradition they carried. The recognition was not always conscious. It was not always expressed in explicit terms, but it shaped the choices those families made, about where to settle, about what to preserve, about what to investigate and what to document, and what to quietly file away in family archives that are not open to general public scrutiny. Those archives exist, in private hands, in collections that are not publicly catalogued, in the possession of families that maintain them with the same custodial care that their ancestors maintained the sacred springs and the landscape alignments of the pre-Norman British world. The documents in those archives, if they could be systematically examined, would very likely change the picture of pre-Columbian American history significantly. They would provide evidence for connections and contacts and transmissions of knowledge that the isolation doctrine has consistently denied. Whether those archives will ever be made accessible is a question that depends on the choices of the families that hold them. Choices that are influenced by the same considerations that have shaped those families' relationship to this knowledge for centuries. The question of what it serves to reveal and what it serves to continue to hold. But the physical landscape does not require any family's permission to speak. The stone chambers are still there. The Ogham inscriptions are still there. The earthworks are still there, those that have not been destroyed by development and agriculture. The astronomical alignments are still there. And the genetic record, increasingly accessible through the expanding databases of ancient DNA research, is beginning to tell a story that is consistent with the physical evidence. The ancient DNA evidence from pre-Columbian American populations is still being assembled, and it is preliminary and contested, as all emerging genetic evidence tends to be. But certain results have already appeared that are difficult to explain on the basis of the isolation doctrine. Results that suggest genetic connections between certain pre-Columbian American populations and populations of the Atlantic fringe of Europe. Results that mainstream genetics has responded to with the same combination of categorical dismissal and selective citation that mainstream archaeology has applied to the physical evidence of pre-Columbian contact. The dismissal is less secure than it once was. The evidence is too consistent, too widespread, too present in too many different lines of inquiry, to continue to be dismissed on the grounds that it does not fit the expected picture. The expected picture is what needs to be revised. The evidence is what it is, and the families know. The families that have maintained the custodianship of this knowledge across the centuries, through the political transformations of the British world, and through the founding of the American colonial enterprise, and through the subsequent history of the American nation, those families know that the picture is more complex than the official version allows. They have always known, and they have maintained that knowledge with the patience and the persistence that is the hallmark of families that have survived and that have kept their knowledge alive through many centuries of official indifference or active suppression. The question of what those families will do with that knowledge, now that the physical and genetic evidence is beginning to converge with what the genealogical and traditional knowledge has always suggested, is one of the more interesting questions in contemporary American cultural and intellectual life. The answer may not come from the families themselves, who have reason to be cautious about too much disclosure. It may come from the evidence itself, from the continuing accumulation of archaeological and genetic and documentary evidence that points consistently toward the same conclusion. The pre-Columbian history of North America is not what the official story says it is. The connections between the Old World and the New in the centuries and millennia before Columbus were real and significant. The families that maintained the knowledge of those connections across the centuries, through the pre-Norman world of Britain and through the colonial founding of America, are real and identifiable. And the landscape of eastern North America still carries, in its stone chambers and its earthworks and its astronomical alignments and its sacred springs, the physical record of those connections. The record is there for those who know how to read it. The families who know how to read it have been reading it for a very long time, and the time is coming when that reading will no longer need to be kept private, when the evidence will be too clear and too consistent to continue to be officially ignored, when the deeper history, the history that the pre-Norman bloodlines of Britain have been carrying across the centuries, will become the recognized history. The history that is taught in the classrooms and displayed in the museums and incorporated into the national story of what America is and where it came from. That time is not yet here, but it is approaching. The evidence is accumulating. The institutional resistance is weakening. The families are watching. And the landscape is waiting, as it has always waited, for the people with the knowledge to read it to come forward and speak. The story that this landscape tells is not a simple story. It is not a story with clear heroes and villains and a clean resolution. It is a story of extraordinary complexity, of knowledge transmitted across centuries in fragmented and transformed forms, of connections maintained across vast distances through the persistence of families who understood, in ways that are difficult to fully articulate, that the world was more connected than the official story allowed, of evidence that has been present and accumulating for 2 centuries, while the institutions responsible for making sense of it have looked the other way. But it is a story that is true, or as close to true as any story about the deep past can be, and it is a story that matters. That has implications for how we understand who we are, and where we come from, and what our relationship to the landscape we inhabit actually is. The pre-Norman families of Britain, the families that owned the land before the conquest and survived afterward by adapting and persisting and maintaining their custodial relationship to their ancestral landscapes, left a legacy that reaches further than anyone has officially acknowledged. Their knowledge, their landscape traditions, their genealogical memory, their Atlantic connections, all of these things survived the centuries of political transformation that followed the Norman Conquest. They survived the Atlantic crossing. They shaped the founding of the American nation in ways that are visible if you know where to look. And they are connected, through threads of evidence that are still being assembled, to the pre-Columbian past of a continent that was never as new, never as isolated, never as unconnected to the rest of the human world, as the official story has always maintained. That is the story. That is the deep truth that the families have been carrying, that the landscape has been holding, that the evidence has been patiently accumulating. The families who owned Britain before the Normans did not simply fade away. Their bloodlines survived. Their knowledge survived. Their connection to the landscape and to the much longer history of human movement across the Atlantic world survived. And it is still here, waiting to be recognized, waiting to be properly understood, waiting for the moment when the full complexity of the human past, the past that includes not just the last 5,000 years of written history, but the much longer and much more connected story of how human beings moved across and related to the world they inhabited, becomes the foundation of a genuinely truthful account of where we come from. We are closer to that moment than we have ever been. The evidence is more comprehensive. The tools for analyzing it are more powerful. The institutional resistance, while still formidable, is less absolute than it once was. And the families, in their patience and their persistence, and their custodial devotion to a truth that has taken a very long time to be ready to be spoken, are still here, watching, waiting, knowing. The landscape remembers everything. The question is only whether we are ready to listen. And as the evidence continues to accumulate, as the genetic studies, and the archaeological discoveries, and the re-examination of documents that have been sitting in archives for centuries, continue to paint a picture that is more complex and more connected and more ancient than anything the official story has been willing to accommodate, the answer to that question is becoming clearer. We are ready. The time for the deeper story, the story that the pre-Norman bloodlines of Britain have been carrying across the centuries, is arriving. The families that owned Britain before the Normans are still here. Their bloodlines still carry the memory. Their connection to the land, both the land of Britain and the land of America, is still active, and the story they carry is stranger and older, and more important than anything that has been officially acknowledged until now. The thread we have been following, the thread that connects the pre-Norman world of Britain to the hidden pre-Columbian history of North America, does not end with the establishment of the American colonies. It continues. It deepens. It becomes more complex as the centuries pass and as the American nation grows and transforms itself from a collection of coastal settlements into a continental empire. And at every stage of that growth, the families we have been tracking, the families that carried the pre-Norman British tradition into the New World, played roles that are more significant and more deliberately shaped by their inherited landscape knowledge than any conventional historical account acknowledges. To understand those roles properly, we need to spend some time on the specific geography of the American expansion. We need to look at the routes by which the American nation extended itself westward from the original Atlantic seaboard settlements into the interior of the continent, because those routes were not chosen arbitrarily. They were not simply the paths of least physical resistance. They were, in a remarkable number of cases, the routes that the pre-Columbian landscape already marked as significant. The routes along which the evidence for pre-Columbian contact was concentrated. The routes that the pre-Norman sacred geography tradition would have recognized as the natural channels of movement through the landscape. The first great route of westward expansion was the route through the gaps in the Appalachian mountain chain. The most famous of these gaps is Cumberland Gap, the natural pass through the Cumberland Mountains at the junction of what is now Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee. Cumberland Gap was the route through which Daniel Boone led settlers into Kentucky in the 1770s, opening the first major corridor of American Western expansion. The famous Wilderness Road ran through Cumberland Gap and became the primary pathway for hundreds of thousands of settlers moving into the Trans-Appalachian West in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. What most accounts of the Wilderness Road and the opening of the Kentucky frontier do not discuss is the pre-Columbian significance of Cumberland Gap. The gap had been used by Native American peoples as a travel corridor for millennia before European Americans arrived. But before the Native Americans, before even the most ancient of the indigenous cultures that we currently have archaeological documentation for, there is evidence that the landscape of Cumberland Gap was significant in ways that the standard archaeological framework does not fully account for. The rock formations in and around the gap contain markings that do not fit the standard typology of Native American rock art. Some of these markings have been identified by researchers familiar with European prehistoric traditions as consistent with European megalithic symbols. The identification is contested, as always with such claims. But the markings are real, and they predate any documented Native American use of the site, and they do not fit any currently recognized indigenous artistic tradition. The family of Daniel Boone himself is interesting in this context. Boone's family came from the English West Country, from a region with deep connections to the pre-Norman Celtic tradition of Britain. The Boone family genealogy, which has been traced with considerable care by American genealogists, shows roots in the borderland region between England and Wales, the region that we have identified throughout this discussion as one of the primary zones of pre-Norman cultural survival. Whether Daniel Boone had any conscious awareness of his family's deep heritage is doubtful, but his remarkable ability to read the American landscape, to navigate by the same kinds of environmental cues that the pre-Norman British tradition taught, to recognize significant landscape features, and to orient himself in wilderness that defeated less perceptive travelers, is consistent with an inherited landscape knowledge that operated below the level of conscious awareness. The Wilderness Road through Cumberland Gap was not the only significant corridor of westward expansion. The other great route was the Ohio River Valley, the great highway of the interior that the Hopewell and other ancient cultures had used as the central axis of their monument-building tradition. The Ohio River connects the Trans-Appalachian Highlands to the Mississippi, and through the Mississippi to the great interior of the continent. It was the route by which the most ambitious of the early American explorers and settlers moved into the heart of the continent. And it was the route along which the most spectacular of the ancient American earthworks were concentrated. The families that moved most quickly and most effectively into the Ohio Valley in the late 18th and early 19th centuries were, in a significant number of cases, families with exactly the kinds of Old World connections we have been describing. The Virginia military families that received grants of Ohio Valley land in payment for Revolutionary War service included a disproportionate number of families with Welsh and Scottish and Border English roots. The New England families that moved into the Western Reserve of northeastern Ohio, the territory claimed by Connecticut on the basis of its colonial charter, included families whose genealogies trace back to the same pre-Norman British traditions. These families found themselves settling on and around the great Hopewell earthwork complexes. They built their farms in the valleys where the ancient ceremonial centers had stood. They ploughed their fields through the edges of earthworks that were still, in the early years of settlement, substantially intact. They built their houses near the same springs and river confluences that the ancient builders had chosen as the centers of their sacred geography. And they noticed things. The more observant among them noticed that the ancient earthworks were not random, that they had a geometry, that they were oriented in ways that connected them to each other and to features of the natural landscape, that they represented, in some way they could not fully articulate, a sophisticated understanding of the landscape that resonated with something in their own tradition. Some of them documented what they saw. The early surveys of the Ohio earthworks, the work of men like Caleb Atwater and Ephraim Squire, were produced by people with deep roots in the pre-Norman British tradition. Atwater was a New Englander with Welsh ancestry. Squire, who produced with his collaborator Edwin Davis the most comprehensive early survey of the Ohio earthworks, came from a family with English border roots. Both men were struck, independently, by the sophistication of the monuments they were documenting. Both noted parallels with Old World monuments. Both were careful not to make claims they could not fully support, but both clearly believed that the parallels were significant. Their work was published in 1848 as the first volume of the Smithsonian Contributions to Knowledge series, a publication that gave it the imprimatur of official American scientific establishment. For a brief period, the question of the Ohio earthworks and their Old World connections was on the table in mainstream American scholarship. The isolation doctrine had not yet hardened into the orthodoxy it would become in the later 19th century. The possibility of Old World connections was discussed, debated, taken seriously. Then something happened, or rather, a series of somethings happened that, taken together, produced the hardening of the isolation doctrine that has characterized mainstream American archaeology ever since. The Smithsonian Institution, which had given Squire and Davis the platform for their early work on the earthworks, they became increasingly dominated in the later 19th century by figures who were committed to the isolation doctrine for reasons that were as much political as scientific. The doctrine of Native American isolation served specific interests in the context of the late 19th century American political landscape. It served the interests of those who wanted to deny Native American peoples any connection to the sophisticated prehistoric cultures of the earthwork tradition, thereby weakening Native American claims to the land on which those cultures had flourished. It served the interests of those who wanted to frame the American past as a simple binary between the indigenous peoples who had occupied the continent in isolation and the European settlers who had brought civilization, rather than as the complex, multiply-connected story that the evidence actually suggested. The Smithsonian's Bureau of Ethnology, under the leadership of John Wesley Powell in the late 19th century, made the refutation of pre-Columbian contact theories an explicit institutional priority. Cyrus Thomas, a Smithsonian archaeologist, produced a massive report in 1894 that argued systematically for the Native American origin of the earthworks and against all theories of Old World connection or construction by a separate mound builder race. The report was thorough and in many respects valuable, but it was also driven by an institutional agenda that went beyond the evidence, and it overreached in its categorical dismissal of all evidence for Old World connection. The institutional weight of the Smithsonian behind the isolation doctrine effectively ended mainstream discussion of pre-Columbian contact in American archaeology for most of the 20th century. Researchers who continued to pursue the question did so outside the mainstream, without institutional support, often subject to active professional discrediting. The question was not resolved, it was suppressed. And the suppression was enforced by exactly the kind of institutional power that the founding families, through their control of the Smithsonian and the universities and the learned societies, had established over the interpretation of the American past. This is not a coincidence. The founding families of the American intellectual establishment were the same families whose genealogical connections to the pre-Norman British world we have been tracing. And those families had, by the later 19th century, developed a complicated relationship to the knowledge of pre-Columbian contact that their tradition carried. On one hand, that knowledge was part of their heritage, part of the tradition they had brought from the Old World, and that had shaped their relationship to the American landscape from the beginning of their colonial presence. On the other hand, acknowledging that knowledge publicly, in the form of support for pre-Columbian contact theories, would have complicated enormously the land title claims and the historical narratives on which the legitimacy of their position in American society rested. The compromise they reached, not through any explicit conspiracy, but through the accumulation of individually motivated institutional decisions, was to suppress the public discussion of pre-Columbian contact while maintaining, in private family traditions and in the restricted archives of learned societies, the knowledge that the public discussion was suppressing. The Smithsonian's categorical dismissal of contact theories was the public face of a tradition that, in private, continued to acknowledge the reality of those contacts. This bifurcation between public and private knowledge is one of the most characteristic features of the families we have been discussing. It reflects the long tradition, going back to the pre-Norman period in Britain, of maintaining certain kinds of knowledge in forms that were accessible to those within the tradition, while being invisible or incomprehensible to those outside it. The pre-Norman families of Britain had maintained their sacred geography knowledge in Welsh and in the encoded forms of bardic tradition, while adopting Norman French for their formal legal and administrative dealings. The founding families of America maintained their knowledge of pre-Columbian contact in private family traditions, while adopting the isolation doctrine for their public institutional pronouncements. The parallels are exact, and they are not accidental. They reflect the same fundamental strategy of survival that had served these families through many centuries of political transformation: adapt to the dominant political context, maintain the essential knowledge in protected forms, and wait for the moment when circumstances allow for greater disclosure. That moment, as we have been suggesting throughout this discussion, may now be approaching. The genetic evidence and the archaeological evidence and the documentary evidence are all converging on a picture that the isolation doctrine cannot adequately accommodate. The institutions that have maintained the isolation doctrine are facing increasing challenges from researchers outside the mainstream who have access to evidence that the institutions have not been able to fully suppress. And the families that have maintained the private knowledge are finding that the value of continued secrecy is diminishing relative to the cost of continued suppression. But there is another dimension to this story that we have not yet addressed, a dimension that goes beyond the question of pre-Columbian contact and into the question of what the families that maintained the knowledge of that contact have done with it in the more recent past. What have they built with it? What institutions have they created? What landscapes have they shaped? And how does their shaping of the American landscape in the historical period reflect the sacred geography tradition that they brought from the pre-Norman world? The answer to these questions is visible in the landscape of the American capital. Washington, D.C. was designed and built with an intentionality that goes far beyond the practical requirements of housing a national government. The specific geography of the capital, its position on the Potomac River between the territories of Virginia and Maryland, its orientation toward the cardinal directions and toward specific astronomical events, the specific placement of the major monuments and government buildings in relationship to each other and to the natural landscape features of the site, all of this reflects a tradition of sacred geography that is recognizably related to the pre-Norman British tradition we have been discussing. The men who designed and positioned the American capital were men with deep roots in the pre-Norman British world. George Washington himself, whose family we have mentioned, chose the site and supervised the early planning. Pierre-Charles L'Enfant, the French architect who produced the original plan for the city, was working within a tradition of landscape design that had its deepest roots in the European tradition of sacred geometry. And the specific astronomical alignments that are built into the Washington, D.C. street grid, alignments that have been documented by researchers both mainstream and alternative, reflect a knowledge of astronomical landscape design that is consistent with the sacred geography tradition of the pre-Norman British world. The Capitol building is oriented so that its dome faces the sunrise at the summer solstice. The Washington Monument is positioned so that it serves as a gnomon, casting shadows that mark astronomical events on the surrounding landscape. The National Mall is an axis that, when extended, points towards specific landscape features in the surrounding countryside that have astronomical significance. These are not coincidences. They are deliberate design choices made by people who understood the principles of sacred landscape design and who applied those principles to the creation of the new national capital. The tradition they were drawing on was the tradition we have been tracing throughout this discussion. The tradition of sacred geography that the pre-Norman families of Britain maintained and transmitted across the centuries. The tradition that understood landscape not as empty space to be filled with practical structures, but as a living entity with its own patterns and rhythms and sacred features that human construction should acknowledge and honor. The founding of Washington, D.C. was, in this reading, an act of landscape custodianship in the tradition of the pre-Norman British aristocracy. An act of setting the sacred geography of the new national landscape on the same foundations that the sacred geography of the old British landscape had rested on. An act of connecting the new world capital to the same cosmic order that the ancient monuments of Britain and Ireland had been built to express. Whether the founders of Washington, D.C. understood their own actions in these terms is a question that cannot be answered simply. Some of them almost certainly did, at least in part. George Washington's associations with Freemasonry are well documented, and the Masonic tradition, whatever its specific historical origins, is one of the vehicles through which elements of the pre-Norman British sacred geography tradition were transmitted into the early modern period. The Masonic understanding of sacred architecture, of buildings and cities as expressions of cosmic order, of landscape design as a form of spiritual practice, is consistent with the tradition we have been tracing. Others of the founders may have understood what they were doing only intuitively, through the same kind of landscape sensitivity that we have described as a characteristic of families with deep pre-Norman British roots, the sensitivity that made certain landscape choices feel right without any explicit theoretical justification. Either way, the result is the same. The American capital was built according to principles of sacred landscape design that derive from the same tradition as the sacred landscapes of the pre-Norman British world. And the families that built it were the same families, in genealogical descent, if not in explicit consciousness of that descent, that had maintained the tradition across the centuries. The continuity is remarkable, and it is one more piece of evidence for the larger claim we have been building throughout this discussion. The claim that the pre-Norman bloodlines of Britain did not simply disappear at the Norman Conquest, that they survived, adapted, transmitted their knowledge, crossed the Atlantic, shaped the founding of the American nation, and continue to exercise influence over the American landscape and the interpretation of the American past in ways that are documented but rarely discussed. Now let us address directly the question of what they currently control, because the title of this discussion promised to answer that question. And the answer is both more specific and more diffuse than any simple conspiracy theory would suggest. What the pre-Norman bloodlines of Britain currently control, insofar as they exercise any collective control at all, is institutional culture. The shared assumptions, the unquestioned premises, the taken-for-granted background of decisions about what questions are worth asking, what evidence is worth taking seriously, what narratives are permissible in the mainstream conversation about the American past. This is not a formal control. It is not exercised through explicit decision-making in any identifiable forum. It is exercised through the accumulated weight of genealogical connection, of educational background, of family tradition and institutional loyalty that shapes the perspectives of the people who run the institutions that determine what is and is not the official story of the American past. The great universities that produce the archaeologists and the historians who write the textbooks and run the museums and determine what gets excavated and what gets ignored, those universities were founded by families with deep pre-Norman British roots, and they have been led and staffed in disproportionate numbers by descendants of those families in the generations since their founding. Harvard was founded by the Massachusetts Bay Colony's Puritan leadership, a leadership drawn significantly from families with Welsh and Border English roots. Yale was founded by families with similar roots. Princeton, William and Mary, the other colonial colleges, all were products of the same founding elite. The Smithsonian Institution, the great museum and research complex that has been the primary official arbiter of American archaeology for more than a century and a half, was funded by a bequest from an Englishman named James Smithson. Smithson was the illegitimate son of the Duke of Northumberland, a family with roots in exactly the northern English border territory that we have identified as a major zone of pre-Norman British cultural survival. Whether Smithson's decision to leave his estate to the United States for the creation of an institution, for the increase and diffusion of knowledge, reflects any conscious connection to the pre-Norman British tradition is impossible to say with certainty. But the institutional lineage is there. The land grant system that distributed the public lands of the United States as the nation expanded westward was administered by a series of institutions: the General Land Office, the Department of the Interior, the Bureau of Land Management, all of which were shaped in their early years by exactly the same founding families we have been discussing. The decisions those institutions made about which lands to allocate for what purposes, which areas to designate as significant and worthy of protection, and which to open for commercial exploitation, those decisions were made by people whose understanding of the landscape was shaped, consciously or not, by the sacred geography tradition we have been tracing. This is what the pre-Norman bloodlines of Britain control, not through any formal conspiracy, but through the accumulated institutional weight of genealogical connection and shared cultural inheritance. They control the assumptions that determine what the official story of the American past is. They control the institutional frameworks that determine how the physical evidence of that past is evaluated and interpreted. And they control, in many cases, the actual land on which the most significant evidence of the pre-Columbian connections we have been discussing is located. The land holdings of the oldest American families, the families with the deepest genealogical roots in the pre-Norman British world, are concentrated in exactly the areas where the evidence for pre-Columbian contact is most significant. The great estates of the Virginia Tidewater, the old land grants of New England, the antebellum plantations of the Carolina Piedmont, the family holdings that have been maintained across generations in the Appalachian Highlands. These are not coincidences of real estate history. They reflect the same landscape sensitivity, the same orientation towards significant landscape features that we have identified as a characteristic of families with pre-Norman British roots. And on those lands, in the archives of those families, in the oral traditions that are maintained within those families and transmitted from generation to generation in forms that are not accessible to outside researchers, the evidence continues to be held. The letters and journals and maps and surveys that document the pre-Columbian landscape features that are now lost, the genealogical records that trace the specific threads of connection between the pre-Norman British world and the founding families of colonial America, the traditional knowledge about which places in the American landscape are significant and why, knowledge that was transmitted from the pre-Columbian landscape to the early colonial settlers through exactly the kinds of channels we have been describing throughout this discussion. Whether that evidence will ever be fully made public is a question that depends on choices that the families themselves must make. The tradition they have maintained, the tradition of custodial care for knowledge that the dominant culture is not ready or willing to accommodate, has served them well across many centuries. It would be surprising if they abandoned it quickly or easily. But the world is changing around them. The tools for investigating the past are becoming more powerful. The accumulation of evidence from multiple independent lines of inquiry is making the official story increasingly difficult to maintain. And the costs of continued suppression, in terms of the distortion of the public understanding of the American past and the injustice done to the Native American peoples, whose connection to a complex and internationally connected prehistory continues to be denied, are becoming harder to justify. The pre-Norman bloodlines of Britain have maintained their knowledge and their institutional influence across many centuries by being patient and strategic and adaptive. The same qualities that allowed them to survive the Norman Conquest and its aftermath allow them to recognize when the moment for a different approach has arrived. That moment may be arriving now. And when it does, the story of the families who owned Britain before the Normans and who shaped the founding of America and who have maintained across the centuries the knowledge of a pre-Columbian past, more complex and more connected than any official account has acknowledged, will finally be told in its full complexity, not as a conspiracy theory, not as a simple tale of hidden elites and suppressed knowledge, but as the genuine and deeply human story of families trying to maintain continuity across centuries of change, of knowledge trying to survive in whatever forms the circumstances of each era will allow, of a landscape waiting, with the patience of stone, for the people who know how to read it to speak. The landscapes of Britain and North America carry that story. The blood of the families that have moved between those landscapes carries it. And the evidence, the physical and genetic and documentary evidence, is assembling itself into a picture that is finally becoming impossible to ignore. The families who owned Britain before the Normans are still here. Their knowledge is still alive. And the story they carry, the story of a world more ancient and more connected than any official history has been willing to acknowledge, is finally ready to be told. Listen to the landscape. Read the evidence. Follow the bloodlines. The answer is there. It has always been there, waiting for those who know how to look. And now, perhaps, the looking can begin in earnest. Because the truth is not buried so deep that it cannot be recovered. It is present in the land, in the archives, in the DNA, in the genealogies, in the traditions that the families have maintained across the centuries. It is present in the stone chambers of New England, which are not root cellars. It is present in the Ogham inscriptions of the Appalachians, which are not natural features. It is present in the astronomical alignments of the Ohio earthworks, which are not coincidences. It is present in the genetic record of the pre-Columbian American populations, which is not yet fully read, but which is already telling a story that the isolation doctrine cannot contain. And it is present in the families themselves, in their genealogies and their archives and their landscape traditions and their quiet, persistent, centuries-long maintenance of a knowledge that the dominant culture has not been ready to acknowledge. The world before the Normans was a connected world. The Atlantic was a road, not a barrier. The families that knew that road travelled it. The knowledge they carried made the crossing with them. And the landscape they settled in the New World recognized them, as they recognized it, because it had been shaped by people who understood the same fundamental principles of sacred geography that the pre-Norman British tradition embodied. That recognition, that deep structural resonance between the Old World tradition and the New World landscape, is the hidden thread that runs through the entire history we have been tracing. From the Neolithic monuments of Britain to the Hopewell earthworks of Ohio, from the Druidic astronomy of the Iron Age to the astronomical landscape design of Washington, D.C., from the Celtic sea roads of the Atlantic Bronze Age to the mystery of how human beings reached the Americas in the millennia before Columbus, the thread is there. It can be followed. And following it leads to a past that is stranger and older and more deeply human than anything the official story has been willing to acknowledge. The families know. The landscape knows. And now, perhaps, you know too. The story does not end here. It never ends. The past is alive in the present in ways that we are only beginning to understand. The blood of the pre-Norman British world flows through the veins of people who are alive today, people who carry in their DNA and in their family traditions echoes of a world that the official story has declared dead and gone for nearly 1,000 years. But nothing is truly dead and gone while the knowledge of it persists, while the landscape that carried it still stands, while the families that maintained it across the centuries are still here. The families who owned Britain before the Normans are still here. Their bloodlines still control, in the subtle and diffuse and institutionally embedded way we have described, many of the institutions that determine what the official story of the American past is and will be. And in their archives, in their genealogies, in their family traditions and their landscape custodianship, they hold the knowledge that could change that story. The evidence for pre-Columbian Atlantic connections between the British Isles and North America is real. It is present in the physical record. It is consistent with the genetic record. It is coherent with the documentary record. And it is supported by the traditions of the families who have maintained it across the centuries. The suppression of that evidence has served specific institutional interests that are themselves the product of the same genealogical networks. The families that controlled the institutions that suppressed the evidence were the same families that possessed the private knowledge of what the evidence showed. That arrangement is becoming increasingly untenable. The evidence is too widespread, too consistent, too present in too many independent lines of inquiry to continue to be suppressed by institutional weight alone. And the landscape, which has been waiting with the patience of stone and earth and ancient water, is ready to speak. Listen, the story is there, it always has been. In the stone chambers and the earthworks and the inscriptions and the sacred springs and the astronomical alignments, in the genealogies and the archives and the family traditions, in the blood, the families who owned Britain before the Normans left a legacy that reaches further and runs deeper than any official history has been willing to acknowledge. But the truth is patient. It outlasts the institutions that suppress it. It outlasts the political interests that distort it. It outlasts even the families that carry it, because it is not simply their possession. It belongs to the landscape. It belongs to the evidence. It belongs to everyone who is willing to look honestly at what the record shows. The time for that honest looking is now. The families know, the landscape knows, and the story is finally ready to be told. There is a dimension of this story that we have approached but have not yet entered fully, the dimension of what the land itself remembers. Because the land does remember. Not in any mystical sense that requires a suspension of critical judgment, but in the very practical sense that the physical record of human activity persists in the landscape long after the humans who created it are gone. The earthworks remain, the stone chambers remain, the carved inscriptions remain, the astronomical alignments remain, the sacred springs still flow. The landscape still carries, encoded in its physical features, the record of the human activity that shaped it. And when you walk through that landscape with eyes that have been trained to read it, the record becomes legible in ways that ordinary tourism or ordinary archaeological survey does not reveal. There is a specific quality to landscapes that have been worked by people with sacred geography knowledge, a quality that is difficult to describe to those who have not experienced it, but that is immediately recognizable to those who have. It is a quality of intentionality, of having been arranged, of the landscape, speaking in a language that is not quite visual and not quite conceptual, but that operates somewhere between the two, in the realm of spatial and temporal relationship that sacred geometry is designed to activate. The landscapes of the pre-Columbian eastern United States have this quality in certain places. The places we have been discussing. The Hopewell earthwork complexes of the Ohio Valley, the hilltop enclosures of the Adena tradition in the Appalachian foothills, the great mound centers of the Mississippi Valley, of which Cahokia, near Modern Street, Louis is the most spectacular example, a site that at its height, in the 11th and 12th centuries AD, had a population comparable to contemporary London, and that was organized according to a sophisticated cosmological landscape plan that mainstream archaeology has only recently begun to take fully seriously. Cahokia is one of the most important and least understood sites in the pre-Columbian history of North America. The city, if that is the right word for it, was centered on Monk's Mound, a flat-topped earthen pyramid that is larger at its base than the Great Pyramid of Giza. At its peak in the period around 1100 AD, Cahokia covered an area of roughly 5 square miles and contained at least 120 earthen mounds of various shapes and sizes, arranged in a pattern that encodes astronomical and cosmological information of great sophistication. The city was surrounded by a wooden palisade with watchtowers at regular intervals, and within the palisade the population density was comparable to medieval European cities of the same period. Cahokia was abandoned sometime in the early to mid-14th century, before European contact, and the reasons for its abandonment are not fully understood. Climate change, resource depletion, social upheaval, political collapse, all have been proposed, and all may have played a role. What is certain is that by the time the first European explorers reached the Mississippi Valley in the 16th and 17th centuries, Cahokia had been empty for at least 2 centuries, and its origins were unknown to the Native American peoples the Europeans encountered. The Old World parallels of Cahokia are significant and insufficiently studied. The flat-topped mound form that characterizes Monk's Mound and the subsidiary platform mounds of Cahokia is not unique to the Mississippi Valley. It appears in the monument traditions of Mesoamerica, where it has a long and well-documented history. But it also appears, in different materials, in the monument traditions of the Old World. The great earth platform mounds of Bronze Age Britain, of which Silbury Hill in Wiltshire is the most spectacular example, share the flat-topped platform form with Cahokia and with the Mesoamerican platform pyramids. The similarity in form reflects, at a minimum, a similarity in the cosmological function these structures were meant to serve. Whether that functional similarity reflects contact or convergence is the question that all Old World parallels in American archaeology ultimately reduce to. And in the case of Cahokia, the question is more interesting than usual, because Cahokia's period of maximum florescence, the 11th and 12th centuries AD, coincides with a period of intense long-distance trade connection across the North American continent, trade connections that brought materials from the Rocky Mountains and the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic coast together in a single exchange network centered on the Mississippi Valley. That trade network was capable of moving materials over thousands of miles of continental territory. Whether it was also capable of connecting to the transatlantic trade networks of the Old World is a question that the evidence does not currently allow us to answer definitively. But the sophistication of the trade organization and the logistical capacity that it represents makes the possibility of transatlantic connection less implausible than the isolation doctrine would suggest. And there is one more element of the Cahokia story that is rarely discussed in mainstream accounts. The site is located at a specific geographical node, at the confluence of the Missouri River with the Mississippi, a confluence that is one of the most significant topographical features in the interior of the North American continent. Great Rivers Meeting is, in the sacred geography traditions of both the Old World and the New, a place of special power, a place where energies converge, and where the kind of sustained human attention that creates sacred sites naturally concentrates. The founders of Cahokia chose their site with the same understanding of sacred geography that the builders of the great sacred centers of the Old World brought to their site choices. That understanding, expressed in the specific siting and specific astronomical orientation and specific architectural language of Cahokia's monuments, is what connects the site to the longer story we have been telling. The story of knowledge transmitted across space and time. The story of families and traditions that maintained a specific understanding of the relationship between human activity and the cosmic order, and that expressed that understanding in landscape form across many different cultural contexts and many different periods. The families that have maintained custodianship of that understanding in the forms that have survived into the modern world are the families we have been discussing throughout this night's exploration of the hidden connections between pre-Norman Britain and pre-Columbian America. They are still here. Their knowledge is still alive. And the landscape, patient as stone, is still waiting for those who know how to read it to come forward and speak. We have been moving through time tonight, through the deep time of the pre-Norman world and the even deeper time of the pre-Columbian Atlantic connections that the pre-Norman tradition preserved. We have traced the bloodlines, we have followed the evidence, we have identified the patterns that connect the sacred geography of Britain to the sacred geography of North America, and the families that have maintained both across the centuries. What remains is to bring this into the present, to ask what all of this means for the world we are living in now, for the institutions that shape our understanding of the past, for the landscapes that carry the physical record of what happened, and for the question of how we understand ourselves and our relationship to a past that is more complex and more connected than any official story has been willing to acknowledge. The answer is not simple. Nothing in this story has been simple. But there are things that can be said. The first is that the past is not over. It continues to operate in the present through the institutions and the traditions and the landscape features that it has created. The pre-Norman sacred geography of Britain is not simply a historical curiosity. It is a living tradition, maintained in fragments and transformed forms in the landscape of Britain and in the genealogical memory of the families that have custodianship over it. The pre-Columbian sacred geography of North America is not simply an archaeological puzzle. It is a living landscape feature, present in the earthworks and the stone chambers and the astronomical alignments and the sacred springs that have survived 2 centuries of colonial development. The second is that the connection between these two traditions, the connection we have been tracing throughout this discussion, is also still living. It persists in the genealogical threads that link the pre-Norman British world to the founding families of colonial America. It persists in the institutional structures that those families built and that their descendants continue to shape. It persists in the private knowledge that is maintained in family archives and oral traditions that are not publicly accessible. The third is that this living connection has consequences. It shapes what questions get asked about the American past, what evidence gets taken seriously, what narratives are permissible in the mainstream conversation about pre-Columbian contact. And the suppression of the pre-Columbian contact evidence, which we have documented as a consistent pattern in the institutional history of American archaeology, is one of those consequences. The fourth is that this situation is changing, not quickly or simply, but the evidence is accumulating, the institutional resistance is weakening, and the families that have maintained the private knowledge are finding the value of continued suppression diminishing relative to the cost. The fifth is that the landscape itself is the most powerful argument for change. The stone chambers and the earthworks and the inscriptions and the astronomical alignments are there. They do not require any family's permission to speak. They speak to anyone who is willing to look and listen and think carefully about what they are seeing. The families who owned Britain before the Normans left a legacy that reaches to the present moment. Their bloodlines carry memories that are old and deep and significant. Their institutions shape the conversation about the past in ways that reflect those memories, sometimes by suppressing and sometimes by maintaining. And their landscape custodianship, in both the Old World and the New, preserves the physical record of connections that the official story has consistently denied. All of this is present. All of this is accessible, in one form or another, to those who are willing to look past the official story and engage with the evidence that the official story has not been able to accommodate. The pre-Norman bloodlines of Britain still control many of the institutions that shape our understanding of the American past. They still hold much of the land on which the most significant evidence of pre-Columbian contact is located. And they still maintain, in forms that are not publicly accessible, much of the knowledge that could change our understanding of that past. But the evidence is speaking for itself. The landscape is speaking for itself. And the time when the full story can be told, the story that the pre-Norman bloodlines have been carrying across the centuries, may finally be arriving. The families who owned Britain before the Normans are still here. Their bloodlines still reach across the Atlantic. Their knowledge still shapes the world. And the story they carry, the story of a world more ancient and more connected than any official history has been willing to acknowledge, is finally ready to be heard. Listen to the evidence, follow the bloodlines, read the landscape. The answer has always been there. In the stone and the water and the aligned stars and the ancient earthworks and the genealogical threads that connect the pre-Norman world of Britain to the hidden prehistory of the continent we call America. In the families that have maintained that knowledge across the centuries, through every political transformation and every institutional suppression and every generation of official silence. In the land itself, which remembers everything, which holds the record of everything that has happened on it and around it and through it, and which has been waiting, with the patience of something far older than any human institution, for the people who know how to read it to come forward and speak. That time is now. The story is here. You have been listening to it, and now you know. There is one final thread to pull, and it may be the most important of all. We have talked about the families. We have talked about the landscape. We have talked about the evidence. But we have not talked about what all of this means at the most intimate and personal level. At the level of individual human beings carrying within them the weight of a history that is largely invisible to the world around them. Because that is what the custodianship of knowledge across centuries actually looks like, from the inside. It does not look like a secret society meeting in a candlelit chamber. It does not look like a conspiracy of the powerful shaping events from behind the scenes. It looks like a family. Like a grandmother who tells stories to her grandchildren on long winter evenings, stories that seem to be about the past but are really about how to see the world. It looks like a father walking his son through a particular stretch of countryside and teaching him to read what the land says about its own history and about the history of the people who have lived on it. It looks like an archive in a family home, boxes of letters and documents that have never been catalogued by any external institution, that are known about only within the family, that contain within them the accumulated records of many generations of careful attention to the landscape and to the human history embedded in it. This is the reality of transgenerational knowledge transmission. It is not dramatic. It is not secret in any formal sense. It is simply the ordinary business of families who have maintained a relationship to their history across many generations, who have found ways to keep alive, through the changes of the centuries, the knowledge that their ancestors considered important, and the knowledge that the pre-Norman British families considered important, the knowledge of sacred geography and landscape custodianship and Atlantic connection that we have been tracing throughout this discussion. That knowledge was worth keeping alive. Not because it serves the narrow interests of those who hold it, though it has certainly done that too, but because it is knowledge of something real, of how the landscape actually works, of how human communities can maintain sustainable relationships with the natural world, of how the long-distance networks that connect human communities across vast distances actually operate, and what their existence means for how we understand the deep past of our species. These are not esoteric or useless kinds of knowledge. They are precisely the kinds of knowledge that the modern world needs most urgently. The knowledge of sustainable landscape management. The knowledge of long-distance community connection. The knowledge of how to understand the deep past of the places where we live and what obligations that past creates. The pre-Norman families of Britain understood all of these things, not in the form of academic disciplines or policy frameworks, but as lived knowledge, transmitted from generation to generation through the ordinary practices of family and community and landscape relationship. And some of that knowledge has survived, in the traditions that the families have maintained, in the landscape features that the families have protected, in the archives that the families have preserved, making that knowledge accessible, making it available for the larger conversation that the modern world needs to have about its relationship to the past and to the natural world, would be a significant act of cultural contribution. The families that hold it are in a position to make that contribution. Whether they will and how and in what form is a question that only time and their own choices can answer. But the possibility is there, and it is a more hopeful possibility than any simple story of hidden elites and suppressed knowledge might suggest, because the knowledge itself, the knowledge that the pre-Norman British families have been carrying across the centuries, is not knowledge that serves the interests of secrecy. It is knowledge that thrives in the open. That becomes more valuable, not less, when it is shared and tested and built upon by the larger community of people who are trying to understand the deep past of the places they inhabit. The families who owned Britain before the Normans carried that knowledge across 1,000 years of political change. They carried it across the Atlantic. They embedded it in the landscape of the New World, and they have maintained it, in private and in the face of official indifference or suppression, to the present day. The question of whether they will now bring it fully into the public domain, of whether the knowledge that has been held in custodianship for so many centuries will finally be shared with the broader world that needs it, is one of the most interesting questions in contemporary cultural life. And the answer, if it comes, will not come from any dramatic announcement or single revelatory document. It will come the way all genuine historical understanding comes. Gradually, through the accumulation of evidence, through the patient work of researchers who are willing to follow the threads wherever they lead, through the slow transformation of institutional culture that allows previously suppressed questions to be asked again, through the landscape itself, which has always been speaking, to those who know how to listen, the pre-Norman bloodlines of Britain are still here. Their knowledge is still alive. And the story they carry, the story of a world more ancient and more connected than any official history has yet acknowledged, is still being told. In stone, in water, in earth, in blood, in the family traditions that the centuries have not been able to erase, in the landscape that remembers everything, and in the deep, patient knowledge that some families have been carrying across the centuries, waiting for the moment when the world is ready to hear what they have always known. That moment is here. The story is this, and now you know it too. The families who owned Britain before the Normans never truly lost their inheritance, not their land, which many of them in fact regained or retained in various forms across the centuries, not their knowledge, which they transmitted with the care and the patience that only those who understand the true value of what they hold can sustain across generations, not their connection to the landscape, which was the deepest and most durable form of their inheritance, the one that no conquest could sever and no political transformation could fully erase. They are still here, in the old families of the Welsh border country, in the ancient dynasties of Scotland, whose roots go back before the historical record to the world of the Picts and the early Gaels, in the Irish families that maintained continuity with a Celtic tradition that the Norman Conquest never fully reached, in the Anglo-Irish families that absorbed elements of all these traditions into a hybrid identity that was neither fully British nor fully Irish, but something older and stranger than either. And, in America, in the founding families that carried these traditions across the Atlantic, in the institutions they built, in the land grants they secured, in the archives they maintained, in the genealogical consciousness that they passed to their descendants, in the landscape choices their descendants continued to make, generation after generation, with a consistency that reflects inherited knowledge operating across centuries of transformation. The bloodlines control everything. Not in the crude sense of a conspiracy, but in the deeper sense of institutional culture, of shared assumption, of the taken-for-granted background of every decision about what matters and what does not. What questions are worth asking? What evidence is worth taking seriously? What narratives are permissible in the conversation about who we are and where we came from? And within that institutional culture, within the framework of shared assumption that the pre-Norman bloodlines of Britain have built across centuries of presence in the American world, the hidden history of pre-Columbian contact has been maintained in suppression. The evidence has been present. The knowledge has been present. The families have known. And the official story has continued, for institutional reasons that have more to do with the interests of those who control the institutions than with the weight of the evidence, to deny what the landscape has always been saying. That cannot continue indefinitely. The evidence is too widespread, too consistent, too present in too many independent lines of inquiry. The institutional resistance is too transparently motivated by interests that have nothing to do with historical truth. And the moment for a different relationship to this evidence, a relationship of genuine inquiry rather than suppression, is approaching. When it arrives, the story of the families who owned Britain before the Normans will finally be understood in its full complexity, not as a story of simple displacement and loss, but as a story of survival, adaptation, and transmission, of knowledge maintained across centuries against significant pressure to abandon it, of landscape custodianship practiced across the boundaries of political systems and cultural transformations, of a connection between the old world and the new that is older and more complex and more deeply human than any simple story of discovery and conquest can contain. That story is here. It has been here all along. And now, at last, it is being told. The rivers, remember. That is something the old families of Britain used to say, in various forms, in various languages, across many centuries of living alongside the great waterways of the islands. The rivers remember, the hills remember, the springs remember, the stone remembers. And the people who learned to listen to what the land said about its own past were the people who understood most clearly where they stood in the long unfolding of human time. This is not mysticism. It is a form of practical wisdom that is now, ironically, being validated by the sciences of the 21st century. The science of landscape ecology has established that rivers and hills and springs and stone do in fact carry records of what has happened in and around them in forms that trained investigators can read with increasing precision. The isotopic record in water and stone, the pollen record in wetland sediments, the genetic record in soil and in the ancient DNA preserved in burial sites, the astronomical record encoded in the alignments of ancient monuments. These are not mystical categories. They are physical records, written in the materials of the landscape, that can be decoded by those with the knowledge and the tools to read them. The families that have been maintaining what we have been calling sacred geography knowledge were, in their own tradition, doing something analogous to what these sciences now do more formally and more systematically. They were reading the landscape record. They were maintaining the ability to decode what the land said about its own history. And they were transmitting that ability across generations, in the only forms available to them, the forms of oral tradition and family practice and landscape relationship, across the many centuries that separated them from the world of formal scientific inquiry. The knowledge they were maintaining was not always accurate in its specific details. The stories that encoded landscape information were subject to the distortions that all oral transmission introduces over time. The specific attributions, the specific identification of who built what and when, the specific claims about connections and origins, many of these were wrong in ways that the scientific record can now identify. But the underlying knowledge, the knowledge that certain places were significant and why, the knowledge of how to read the landscape record, the knowledge of what kinds of features were indicators of ancient human activity and what that activity might mean, much of that underlying knowledge was sound. And it is precisely that sound underlying knowledge that makes the traditions of these families worth taking seriously, even when the specific stories they tell must be subjected to critical scrutiny. The sacred geography of the British Isles is real. The astronomical alignments of the Neolithic and Bronze Age monuments are real. The evidence for long-distance maritime connection across the Atlantic fringe of Europe is real. The evidence for pre-Columbian contact between the Old World and the New is real. The genealogical connections between the pre-Norman aristocracy of Britain and the founding families of colonial America are real. These are not claims that require any suspension of critical judgment. They are claims that are supported by evidence that can be evaluated by standard scholarly methods. What requires critical judgment is the question of how these real phenomena connect to each other. How the sacred geography tradition of Britain connects to the pre-Columbian landscape of North America. How the genealogical connections between old British families and American founding families connect to the institutional suppression of pre-Columbian contact research. How the private knowledge maintained in family traditions connects to the physical and genetic and documentary evidence that is publicly available. These connections are real, but they are complex. They are real, but they are not simple. They resist the kind of clean narrative that conspiracy theories offer and that sensational history demands. The truth, as always, is more complicated and more interesting than any simple story. But the truth is there, in the landscape, in the archives, in the genealogies, in the genetic record, in the traditions of the families that have maintained their custodianship of this knowledge across the centuries. And the task of recovering that truth, of assembling the evidence into a picture that is both honest and complete, is the most important work that anyone interested in the deep past of the human presence in North America can do. The families who owned Britain before the Normans are part of that picture. Their bloodlines are part of that picture. Their knowledge and the institutional frameworks through which they have maintained and sometimes suppressed that knowledge are part of that picture. The full picture is still being assembled, but what is already visible is extraordinary. It shows a world more connected, more complex, more deeply human in its long-distance relationships and its transmission of knowledge across time and space than any official history has yet been willing to acknowledge. The landscape is waiting. The evidence is there. The families know. And now, perhaps, the rest of us can begin to know too. That is the story of the families who owned Britain before the Normans. The story of what they knew and how they transmitted it and where that knowledge eventually led. The story of a connection between the old world and the new that is older than Columbus and deeper than any simple story of discovery can contain. It is a story that belongs to all of us, because the past belongs to all of us, because the landscape belongs to all of us, because the deep human capacity for maintaining knowledge and connection and community across vast distances and long time periods is not the exclusive possession of any family or any tradition. It is what we are. It is what we have always been. The families who owned Britain before the Normans understood that. It is why they maintained their knowledge with such patience. It is why they continued to read the landscape and transmit what they read across so many centuries of change. It is why the thread that connects their world to ours has not broken, even under the weight of 1,000 years of transformation. That thread is still here. You have been following it tonight, and the landscape, patient as always, is glad that someone is finally listening. And yet there is one more thing that needs to be said. One more layer of this story that we have approached, but not fully entered. The layer that concerns not just the families and the landscape and the evidence and the institutions, but the question of what it means to be a human being in relationship to a past this deep and this complex. Because that is ultimately what all of this is about. Not the specific genealogical connections, not the specific archaeological sites, not the specific institutional mechanisms of suppression. Those things matter. They are real and they are important. But they are means to an end, and the end is this: an honest, complete, fully human understanding of where we come from and what that means for who we are. The people who built the great monuments of the pre-Norman British world were human beings like us. The people who maintained the sacred geography traditions of the Celtic Iron Age were human beings like us. The people who made the Atlantic crossings, in whatever forms and in whatever periods those crossings occurred, were human beings like us. The people who built the great earthwork complexes of the Ohio Valley, who encoded astronomical knowledge in the geometry of their monuments with a precision that rivals the best that the Old World achieved, were human beings like us. And the families that have maintained the memory of these things across the centuries, adapting their knowledge to each new political and cultural context, finding ways to keep alive the understanding of a past that the dominant institutions of each era wanted to simplify or suppress, those families were and are human beings like us. This is the essential point. The past we are recovering, the past that the pre-Norman bloodlines of Britain carry in their traditions, and that the landscape of Eastern North America carries in its stone and earth and water, is not the past of some separate and alien people. It is our past. The past of human beings who had the same fundamental capacities that we have, the same curiosity about the world, the same drive to understand their relationship to the cosmos, the same need to connect with other human communities across the distances that separated them, the same desire to leave something behind, to mark the landscape with evidence of their presence and their knowledge that would speak to those who came after them. We are those who came after them. We are the inheritors of everything they built, and everything they knew, and everything they transmitted across the centuries. The knowledge of the pre-Norman British sacred geography tradition, the evidence of the pre-Columbian Atlantic connections, the physical record that the landscape of Eastern North America carries of a human past, more complex and more internationally connected than any official story has been willing to acknowledge. All of this is ours to inherit, if we are willing to claim it, if we are willing to look honestly at the evidence and follow it where it leads, if we are willing to question the institutional frameworks that have shaped our understanding of the past and ask whether those frameworks have served the pursuit of truth or the pursuit of other interests. The families who owned Britain before the Normans have been asking those questions for a long time. In private, within the frameworks of their family traditions, in the landscape custodianship that has been their most durable inheritance, it is time to ask those questions in public. In the light, with all the evidence on the table, the story is here, the landscape is here, the bloodlines are here, and the truth, patient as the stone that carries it, is finally ready to be heard by everyone, not just the families, not just the researchers, not just the people who know where to look and how to read what they find. Everyone, because this history belongs to all of us, because the deep past of the places we inhabit is part of who we are. Because understanding where we come from, in all its complexity and all its connections, and all its extraordinary human achievement across the distances of time and space, is part of what it means to be fully human. The families who owned Britain before the Normans understood that. That understanding is the deepest thing they have transmitted across the centuries. And now it is yours. The stone does not forget. That is the most important thing the old families of Britain learned in all their centuries of landscape custodianship. Whatever else changes, whatever political systems rise and fall, whatever institutions build themselves up and decay, the stone does not forget. The arrangement of ancient monuments in the landscape is a record that survives everything that human institutions can do to it. The spring that flows from the limestone at a specific point in the landscape has been flowing from that point for longer than any human genealogy reaches. The hill that aligns with the midsummer sunrise at a particular angle has aligned with that sunrise since before the first human being stood on it and noticed what the light was doing. These are the facts of the landscape, and the families that learned to read those facts, to understand what they meant and why they mattered, to maintain that understanding across the centuries. Those families possessed something that no conquest could take from them, and no institutional suppression could erase. They possessed knowledge of how the world actually works, at the deepest level. Not the transactional world of political power and economic competition, though they understood that world too, but the deeper world of landscape and cosmos, and the long cycles of time within which human lives are embedded, and from which human communities draw whatever meaning they are able to find. That knowledge is the inheritance of the pre-Norman British families. That knowledge crossed the Atlantic with them, and that knowledge, now finally, is beginning to be recognized for what it is. Not mysticism, not fantasy, not the wishful thinking of people who want the past to be more dramatic or more connected than it actually was, but genuine human knowledge earned through generations of careful attention to the world, maintained through centuries of patient transmission, and finally, now, beginning to be understood by a wider world that is, perhaps, ready to receive it. The families who owned Britain before the Normans, their bloodlines still here, their knowledge still alive, their landscape still speaking. Listen, the land and the blood and the knowledge are one thing. They were always one thing. The families understood this from the beginning, from the time before the Normans came and tried to separate them. The time of that separation is ending. The time of reunion, of the knowledge returning to the full light of day, where it can be examined and tested and built upon by all who care about the truth of the human past. That time is here. The families who owned Britain before the Normans are the thread that connects the sacred monuments of the old world to the hidden earthworks of the new. Follow that thread. The truth is at the end of it. Always. The evidence has always been here, waiting,